Eleanor, remembered by history as Eleanor Brandon, Countess of Cumberland, a Tudor princess, a niece of kings, and one of the most quietly forgotten women of the 16th century. She was born with royal blood running through her veins and the favour of a king who called her family his own. Raised in the warm glow of one of England's most celebrated households, she grew up surrounded by wealth, beauty, and the kind of privilege that only the closest kin of a monarch could know. And yet, before she was fully grown, she was sent north, far from the court that had shaped her, far from the sister who would carry the family's ambitions, and far from the history books that would one day forget her name entirely. She mourned a queen that no one else was permitted to mourn. She survived a rebellion that swallowed the whole of northern England, and she spent her final months writing a letter that was never meant to be remembered, only read by the one man she trusted above all others. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have only just subscribed, welcome to the family. We are very glad to have you here. And if you are returning to us once again, welcome back home. It is a genuine pleasure, as always, to have you with us tonight. Make yourself comfortable. Lower the lights a little. Let the quiet of the evening settle around you, and allow the day, with all its noise and business, to gently slip away. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the life of Lady Eleanor Brandon, Countess of Cumberland. She was the niece of King Henry VIII, the granddaughter of Henry VII, and the daughter of one of the most remarkable women ever to grace the Tudor court. She lived a life that was, in many ways, shaped entirely by forces beyond her control, by the ambitions of her father, the politics of her uncle, and the dangers of a kingdom in upheaval. And yet, within those constraints, she found her own quiet dignity, her own resilience, and her own way of enduring. We will move slowly through her story tonight, from her earliest years at Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk, through her marriage into the powerful Clifford family of the North, through rebellion and fear and grief, and finally to her gentle, too early death in the autumn of 1547. Each chapter of her life will be told slowly and with care to help guide you toward restful sleep. If you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment letting us know which part of Eleanor's story moved you most will help keep these tales coming for all of us. Now, let us begin. To understand Eleanor Brandon, we must first understand the world into which she was born, a world that was glittering and dangerous in almost equal measure, a world ruled by one of the most powerful and unpredictable monarchs England had ever known. The Tudor dynasty was still relatively young when Eleanor came into the world. Her grandfather, Henry VII, had seized the English throne by force at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending the long and bloody period of dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. He had been a careful king, cautious, calculating, and relentlessly focused on securing his family's grip upon the crown. He had gathered wealth, forged alliances, and bound the nobility to his will through a combination of law, reward, and quiet intimidation. By the time he died in 1509, England was more stable than it had been in decades, and the Tudor name was firmly established at the centre of English life. His son, Henry VIII, was a very different kind of ruler. Where the father had been measured and restrained, the son was bold, brilliant, and utterly dominating. Henry VIII came to the throne at the age of 17, and in those early years, he was widely regarded as everything a Renaissance prince ought to be: tall, athletic, learned, musical, charming, and magnificent in his personal bearing. He dazzled the courts of Europe. He won battles composed music, wrote theological treatises, and surrounded himself with men and women of the highest caliber. To be close to Henry VIII in the early years of his reign was to be at the very centre of the most exciting court in Christendom, and Eleanor Brandon was close, very close, not through her own achievement, but through the remarkable circumstances of her birth. For Eleanor was the daughter of Henry VI's beloved younger sister, the Princess Mary Tudor, a woman who was, in her own right, one of the most extraordinary figures of the Tudor age. Mary Tudor had been born on the 18th of March, 1496, at Sheen Palace in London. She was the youngest surviving child of Henry VII and his queen, Elizabeth of York, a daughter of the House of York, who had been united with the Tudor line through her marriage, helping to heal the wounds left by the Wars of the Roses. Mary grew up in the warmth of a court that, for all its careful politics, was a genuine home to the royal children who were raised within it. From an early age, Mary Tudor was noted for her beauty. A Venetian ambassador who observed her at court described her with something close to wonder, calling her a paradise, tall and slender, with grey eyes and hair of a deep warm gold, and a complexion of extraordinary paleness and delicacy. She was, by every account, one of the most striking young women in England, but she was more than simply beautiful. She was spirited, warm-hearted, and possessed of a will that could, when the occasion demanded, be entirely unyielding. Her brother Henry adored her. Among all his siblings, and he had several, though most died young, Mary was the one he kept closest to his heart. She was a companion to him in his early years, and when he became king, she remained one of the few people in his life who could speak to him with genuine freedom. She was not afraid of him, and he knew it, and that combination of love and frankness made their bond something rare in a court, where most relationships were built upon the careful management of a powerful man's moods. But the life of a royal princess in the 16th century was not entirely her own to shape. From the moment she was old enough to be considered in the calculations of European diplomacy, Mary Tudor became a piece on the great chessboard of international politics, and the first and most significant move on that board came in 1507, when she was still barely 11 years old. In that year, Mary was betrothed to Charles of Castile, the young grandson of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and the future ruler of the most powerful empire in the Western world. The betrothal was celebrated, gifts were exchanged, and for several years it seemed as though Mary's destiny was set. She would marry into the House of Habsburg, and the alliance between England and the great powers of continental Europe would be cemented through her. But Henry VIII was never a man who kept his plans unchanged for long. As the years passed, and the diplomatic landscape of Europe shifted, as old alliances frayed and new opportunities presented themselves, Henry and his powerful minister Cardinal Wolsey began to look elsewhere. By 1514, the betrothal to Charles had been quietly abandoned, and a very different marriage was being arranged for the young princess. Mary was to marry Louis XV of France. The news was, by all accounts, devastating to her. Louis was 52 years old, more than 3 decades older than Mary, and in poor health. He was a widower, and his court at Paris was known for its formality and its severity. Mary was 18 years old, vibrant, full of life, and very much in love, not with the aged French king, but with a young English nobleman named Charles Brandon, who was one of her brother's closest companions and dearest friends. The marriage was a political necessity, and Mary knew it, but before she agreed to go through with it, she extracted a promise from her brother, a promise that would have enormous consequences for the rest of her life, and for the life of the daughter she had not yet conceived. Mary went to her brother and told him plainly what she felt. She was willing to marry Louis of France, she said. She was willing to perform her duty to England and to the Tudor name. But she had one condition. If Louis died, and given his age and failing health, it was not an unreasonable thing to contemplate. She must be allowed afterwards to marry where she chose. Henry, in one of those moments of genuine affection that he was capable of, when his heart, rather than his politics, was speaking, agreed. He gave his sister his word, and Mary, holding that promise close, went to France. The marriage of Mary Tudor and Louis XIV of France took place in October of 1514, and it was, in its outward forms, a magnificent occasion. The joining of two royal houses, celebrated with ceremony and splendour on both sides of the Channel. But the reality of the marriage, behind the pageantry, was far more difficult. Louis was old, he was ill, and he was demanding in the way that powerful men who have lived long lives often become demanding when they finally get the thing they have most desired. Mary endured her role as Queen of France with as much grace as she could muster. She was charming to the French court. She carried herself with the dignity her breeding demanded, and she waited. She did not have to wait long. Louis XIV of France died on the 1st of January 1515, less than 3 months after his wedding. He was 52 years old, and his young wife, who was now the Dowager Queen of France, had barely had time to learn the geography of her new country before she found herself once again free. She did not hesitate. Within weeks of Louis's death, and before a suitable period of mourning had properly elapsed, Mary turned to the man she had loved before her marriage, the man who had accompanied her to France as part of the English delegation, and the man who was her brother's closest friend. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, had been sent to France ostensibly to conduct diplomatic business. He came home as the secret husband of the Queen Dowager of France. The marriage was an extraordinary gamble. To marry a royal widow without the king's explicit permission was, by the laws of Henry's court, a potentially treasonable offence. Charles Brandon had risked his head, and both he and Mary knew it. For a brief, frightening period, it seemed as though the king's anger might indeed cost Brandon his life. But Henry VIII was a man capable of great fury and great tenderness in almost the same breath, and his love for his sister and his genuine affection for Brandon ultimately prevailed over his wounded pride. He forgave them. He fined them heavily, forcing them to pay back a significant portion of the wealth they had accumulated, but he forgave them. In May of 1515, a public marriage ceremony was held, and Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor were formally joined in the sight of God and the English court. It was, by the standards of the Tudor age, a love match of almost scandalous proportions, and it was the union from which Eleanor Brandon would be born. The couple settled, in the years following their marriage, into a life that was prosperous, comfortable, and in many ways far removed from the daily dramas of the court at Westminster. Charles Brandon had been elevated to the Dukedom of Suffolk, one of the grandest titles in England, and with that elevation came lands, revenues, and the responsibility of maintaining a household befitting his rank. He and Mary chose to make their principal home at Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk, a fine country residence set among the gentle, well-cultivated landscapes of East Anglia, far enough from London to offer a degree of peace, yet connected enough to the world of the court to keep them relevant to the great events of the age. Westhorpe Hall was not a palace in the grand sense of the word. It was not built on the scale of Hampton Court or Greenwich, but it was, by the standards of the English gentry, a place of considerable beauty and comfort. It had been developed and enlarged over the years, with good gardens, well-appointed chambers, and the kind of warmth that comes from a house that is genuinely lived in and loved. For Charles and Mary, it was a sanctuary from the pressures of court life, a place where they could raise their children in something approaching peace. And children there were. The Brandon marriage, for all its romantic origins and initial controversy, proved to be genuinely fruitful. The couple had several children together in the years following their marriage. The eldest was a daughter, Frances, who was born in 1517. Then, not long afterwards, came another girl. She was born in 1519 at Westhorpe Hall, and she was given the name Eleanor. Eleanor Brandon came into the world as the third child of Charles and Mary, and the second of their daughters. She was not the firstborn. That distinction belonged to Frances, and she was not the longed-for son who would carry the Brandon name and titles forward. But she was, nonetheless, a child of extraordinary significance. Through her mother, she was the granddaughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, making her a direct descendant of the Tudor royal line. Through her father, she was the daughter of one of the most powerful noblemen in England, a man who stood closer to the king than almost anyone else at court. Her blood was royal, her position was privileged, and from the very beginning, her life was shaped by those facts. What was Eleanor's childhood actually like? The historical record is inevitably somewhat limited on this point. 16th century sources rarely preserve the domestic details of even noble children's early years with any great thoroughness, but we can draw some reasonable inferences from what we know of the world she inhabited, and from the scattered references that have survived. Westhorpe Hall was, during Eleanor's childhood, a genuinely warm and lively household. Her parents, whatever their political circumstances, were people of vivid personality and genuine warmth, and the household they created around them reflected that. Charles Brandon was a man of great physical energy and charm, a former jousting champion, a hunter, a man who loved company and celebration. Mary Tudor was passionate, opinionated, and fiercely devoted to those she loved. Together, they created around their children an atmosphere that was, by the standards of the Tudor aristocracy, relatively close and affectionate. Eleanor grew up alongside her elder sister Frances, who was 2 years her senior and who would, in later years, become one of the most significant and, it must be said, one of the most controversial figures in the drama of the Tudor succession. The two girls would have shared much of their early life, shared lessons, shared play, shared the rituals and routines of a great noble household. They would have known each other well, as sisters in a contained world always do. Their education, as Connor Byrne, who has written thoughtfully about Eleanor's life, has noted, would have followed the conventional pattern for daughters of the high nobility in this period. They would have been taught to dance, an essential social accomplishment for young women of rank, who were expected to perform at court entertainments with grace and confidence. They would have learned to sing, and perhaps to play an instrument, for music was an important part of aristocratic life. They would have been instructed in needlework and embroidery, those patient, precise arts that were considered essential feminine accomplishments, and they would have received instruction in the courtly graces, the manner of moving, speaking, and presenting oneself that distinguished the well-bred noblewoman from everyone else. It is also possible, given the Brandons' close connections with the continental courts and the cultural sophistication of their household, that Eleanor received some instruction in French. Her mother had been Queen of France after all, and the French language, the language of diplomacy, of poetry, of courtly love, was a natural part of the world Eleanor was being prepared to inhabit. Whether Eleanor was a naturally studious child, or whether she applied herself to her lessons with the same passionate energy that characterized her father, or with the more quietly determined manner that characterized her mother, we cannot say. But we know that she was being raised for a specific kind of life, a life of noble marriage, of household management, of representation and ceremony. She was being prepared, in other words, to be a lady of high rank, which meant, in the Tudor world, that she was being prepared to be given away. It should be noted that Eleanor's childhood at Westhorpe was not entirely spent in the company of only her parents and her sister. Charles Brandon had children from an earlier marriage, daughters named Anne and Mary, who were part of the household, at least to some degree. And in the years following Eleanor's birth, there was also a younger brother to consider, Henry Brandon, who was born around 1523 and was created Earl of Lincoln. Henry was a healthy child in his early years, and his presence in the family gave Eleanor a younger sibling, a companion, in the way that younger brothers and sisters can be, and also a reminder that the great expectations of the Brandon family name would, eventually, rest most heavily upon him. Eleanor also had, in these early years, the extraordinary privilege of proximity to the royal court. Her uncle was King Henry VIII, and her parents, particularly her mother, were frequent presences at the court at Westminster, at Greenwich, at Hampton Court, and at the various other palaces that form the geography of Tudor royal life. Eleanor almost certainly visited court on multiple occasions during her childhood. She would have moved, however briefly, through those magnificent spaces, the tapestried halls, the painted chambers, the long galleries where lords and ladies walked and talked and watched each other with careful, evaluating eyes. And at the centre of it all, she would have seen her uncle, that great, golden, overwhelming presence who was King Henry VIII, an Elizabethan Jesuit, writing some decades after Eleanor's death, would record that she and her sister Frances had been the favourite nieces of Henry VIII, that the king had been particularly fond of these two daughters of his beloved sister Mary. We should treat this claim with some caution, as it comes from a single source that cannot be independently verified, but it is entirely plausible. Henry's love for his sister Mary was genuine and deep, and it would have been natural for that love to extend, at least in its warmth, to her children. The king who attended Eleanor's wedding, as we shall later discover, was not merely performing a political duty. There was something personal in his presence. Life at Westhorpe, and in the orbit of the Tudor court, must have seemed, in those early years, very bright and very safe. The world that Eleanor Brandon was born into was one of privilege and possibility, of warmth and connection. She was the granddaughter of a king, the niece of another, and the daughter of two people who had, by one of the great love stories of their age, found their way to each other against considerable odds. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the particular quality of that world, on what it actually felt like to be a child in the Brandon household in the years of Eleanor's growing up. Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk was, in the 1520s, one of the most important private households in England outside the immediate royal circle. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, was one of the wealthiest and most powerful noblemen in the kingdom. He kept a large household: servants, retainers, stewards, chamberlains, musicians, cooks, grooms, all of the vast human machinery that sustained a great aristocratic establishment in the 16th century. His estates in Suffolk and elsewhere provided the revenues that funded this enterprise, and his proximity to the king provided the political weight that made his household a destination for those who sought advancement or favour. Within this world, Eleanor and Frances grew up surrounded by people, not the intimate family circle of the modern imagination, but the populated, semi-public world of the Tudor great household, where one was rarely truly alone and where privacy, in the modern sense, was a largely alien concept. The household had its rhythms and its routines: morning prayers, meals in the great hall or the more intimate parlour, the business of the day's administration, the entertainment of guests, the management of the estates. Eleanor would have known all of these rhythms from her earliest childhood. They were the texture of her daily life. She would also have known her father's particular personality and presence in it. Charles Brandon was, by all accounts, a man of considerable vitality, large in his physical presence, energetic, charming, and entirely comfortable with himself, in a way that only men of enormous confidence and enormous certainty of their own place in the world tend to be. He was known as a companion to the king, not merely because of political convenience, but because he was genuinely good company. A man who could joust, hunt, dance, laugh, and give a party with equal enthusiasm. His children would have known this energy, would have grown up in the field of it, shaped by the particular warmth and vigour that a charismatic father brings to a household, and they would have known their mother's different kind of presence. Mary Tudor was a woman of great feeling and great intelligence, whose warmth was more intimate and more personal than her husband's public charm. She had, by all the evidence we have, a strong maternal instinct and a genuine interest in her children's well-being. The years at Westhorpe, after the controversies of the marriage and the trials of court life, were years in which Mary seems to have found something like contentment, a domestic peace earned at considerable cost and valued accordingly. She would have been, in those years, a present and engaged mother, and her children, Eleanor among them, would have grown up in the warmth of that. But the Tudor world was never, for long, a safe or predictable place, and the events that would shatter Eleanor's golden childhood were, even as she grew and learned and played within the walls of Westhorpe Hall, already beginning to gather in the distance. The year 1533 was a year of extraordinary upheaval throughout the Tudor realm. It was the year in which Henry VIII finally broke with Rome, declaring the authority of the Pope in England to be null and void, and establishing himself, through the act of supremacy that would follow, as the supreme head of the Church of England. It was the year in which he secretly married the woman he had been pursuing for years, the brilliant and dangerous Anne Boleyn. It was the year in which his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had been his queen for nearly a quarter of a century, was formally declared not to have been his wife at all, on the grounds that her earlier marriage to his brother Arthur had never been properly dissolved. These events sent shockwaves through the entire English court. They divided families, destroyed friendships, and forced every person of any consequence in England to make a choice about where their loyalty lay and what their conscience could bear. And they had a very direct, very personal impact on the world of Eleanor Brandon, because Mary Tudor, Eleanor's mother, was one of the people most deeply affected by the king's actions. Mary Tudor had always been close to Catherine of Aragon. The two women had known each other for years, and Mary's sympathies, however careful she was about expressing them openly, lay firmly with the discarded queen. She disliked Anne Boleyn with a passion that she made only limited efforts to conceal. When the king's break with Rome began to unfold, and when Catherine's position became increasingly desperate, Mary found herself in the unenviable position of being both the king's sister and the opponent of his will. She was not in a position to challenge Henry openly. No one was in those years, but her private feelings were known, and they complicated her relationship with her royal brother. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange and frightening the year 1533 must have been for ordinary English people, and indeed for the extraordinary people who moved at the highest levels of English society. In the space of a very few months, the entire spiritual architecture of English life had been thrown into question. The Pope, whose authority had been the foundation of the Christian world for over 1,000 years, had been declared irrelevant to the English crown. The king's marriage, the marriage that had produced a daughter named Mary and had seemed for decades to be a settled fact of English life, had been declared void. A new queen had taken the old queen's place, and the court had been compelled to acknowledge her, to bow to her, to treat her with the deference due to a lawful consort. For those who had been closest to Catherine of Aragon, and Mary Tudor had been among the most loyal of those friends. This was a period of genuine anguish. Mary had known Catherine since the first decade of the century. She had seen Catherine's courage, her dignity, her refusal to accept the humiliation being heaped upon her, and she had been powerless to do anything to help. The king's will was the law, and the law had spoken. Against this turbulent backdrop, the spring of 1533 brought two significant events to Eleanor's world, one that would define the shape of her future life, and one that would leave a wound that never fully healed. The first was a betrothal. In March of 1533, a formal marriage contract was drawn up between Lady Eleanor Brandon and Henry Clifford, the eldest son and heir of Henry Clifford, 1st Earl of Cumberland. Eleanor was 14 years old at the time of the contract signing. Her future husband was approximately 2 years her senior, making him about 16. The match had been arranged, as virtually all noble matches of the era were, not for the pleasure of the two young people involved, but for the political and financial advantage of the families who negotiated it. For the Clifford family, the advantages were obvious. The Cliffords were a powerful northern family, deeply rooted in the landscape and the politics of Yorkshire and the surrounding counties. They held the imposing Skipton Castle in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and their influence in the north was considerable. But they were not royal. Henry Clifford, the father, had risen in prominence during Henry VIII's reign, having been created Earl of Cumberland in 1525 and appointed Warden of the West Marches, the official responsible for defending England's border with Scotland. He was a man of real power in his region, but his family did not carry the blood of kings. The marriage of his son and heir to Eleanor Brandon would change that calculation entirely. Through Eleanor, the Clifford family would acquire a direct connection to the Tudor royal line. They would become the in-laws of a woman whose grandmother had been a Queen of England and whose uncle sat upon the throne. In the genealogical arithmetic of the 16th century, where blood was destiny and royal blood was everything, this was an extraordinarily valuable thing. It is worth thinking for a moment about what Henry Clifford, the first Earl, was actually buying with this match, because the language of purchase, however unromantic, is not entirely inappropriate for the way the Tudor aristocracy thought about the marriage of its children. What he was buying was not simply a bride for his son. He was buying legitimacy of a kind that no amount of military service or political loyalty could provide. He was buying a seat, however distant and however theoretical, at the table of the royal succession. He was buying the right to say, in the company of the greatest nobles in England, that his son's wife was a Tudor, the granddaughter of Henry VII, the niece of Henry VIII. He was buying, in other words, a transformation of his family's status that would echo down the generations long after both he and Eleanor were gone. He paid for it accordingly. As the historical record notes, the Clifford family sold off portions of their estates to meet the costs of both the wedding and the building works at Skipton Castle that were undertaken in anticipation of Eleanor's arrival. This was not a small or casual expenditure. It was a deliberate and considered investment in the family's future. For the Brandon family, the advantages were more nuanced. Eleanor was not their eldest daughter. Francis, the elder, was the one upon whom the greater dynastic hopes were pinned. Eleanor's marriage was therefore arranged, not with the same frantic care, that would be devoted to Francis's match, but with a certain practical thoroughness. The Cliffords were wealthy, respectable, and loyal to the crown. They would provide a good home for Eleanor, and their northern estates and connections would add depth to the Brandon family's already considerable network of influence. There was also a practical financial consideration built into the marriage contract, one that the historical record preserves as a detail of some interest. The contract included a provision for the reduction of the dowry payable to the Clifford family in the event that Eleanor inherited a portion of her father's estates. This was a sensible precaution, given the uncertainty of the times and the possibility that Charles Brandon's death might alter the financial landscape of the arrangement. And as it turned out, this provision became relevant sooner than anyone might have expected, because within a year of the contract being signed, Eleanor's only brother, Henry Brandon, Earl of Lincoln, would die, making Eleanor a more significant heiress than had originally been anticipated. What did Eleanor herself think of this arrangement? The historical record, characteristically, is silent on the matter. She was 14. She had grown up in a world where the marriages of noble daughters were understood to be negotiated by their fathers, and where the personal feelings of the parties involved, while not entirely irrelevant, were secondary to the political calculations of the men who made the arrangements. She had no say in the matter, and there is no evidence that she sought one. What we can say is that her future husband, Henry Clifford, was described by those who knew him as a young man of reasonable appearance, tall and slender by one account, and of studious disposition. He was not, by the standards of the Tudor court, a dashing or particularly exciting figure. He was not a soldier or a courtier of the first rank. He was, it seems, a quieter, more interior kind of man, bookish, perhaps, and given to contemplation. Whether Eleanor, at 14, saw anything in this description to encourage or to discourage her, we cannot know. She simply did as she was told. There is something both familiar and quietly sad in that, the image of a 14-year-old girl, not yet through her childhood, being told that the shape of her entire future life has been decided by men, negotiating in rooms she was not invited to enter. But it would be a mistake to apply modern sensibilities too heavily to this moment. Eleanor's world was not our world. The arrangement of a daughter's marriage was not, within the framework of that world, an act of unkindness or disregard. It was, for the families involved, an act of responsibility, a careful attempt to secure the future of a girl whose blood and whose rank made her life, in a very real sense, a matter of public and political consequence. Eleanor had been born into an obligation as surely as she had been born into a privilege, and the marriage contract was simply the formal expression of that obligation. But before the marriage could take place, and there would be a delay of several years before it was formally solemnized, the second and more devastating event of 1533 struck Eleanor's world. In the early summer of that year, Mary Tudor, the Duchess of Suffolk, fell seriously ill at Westhorpe Hall. Mary had never been entirely robust in her health. She had suffered from recurring illnesses throughout her adult life, from aches and fevers, and from a mysterious and persistent pain in her side that had troubled her for years. Her husband Charles had written, at various points during the 1520s, to Cardinal Wolsey and to others at court, noting that Mary was unwell, that she could not travel, that her old disease in her side was troubling her again. The letters suggest a woman who fought her way through repeated bouts of illness with the same determination that characterized her dealings with everything else in life, but who was, beneath the brightness and the passion, not as strong as she appeared. In the winter and spring of 1533, These ailments had grown steadily worse, and by June it was clear to those around her that she was dying. She had written to her brother the king in January, mentioning that she was sick and ill at ease from a recurring disease. The letters she sent in her final months were signed, according to the historian David Loades, with an increasingly shaky hand, a small physical detail that speaks volumes about the degree of her deterioration. On the 25th of June, 1533, between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, Mary Tudor died at Westhorpe Hall. She was 37 years old. The precise cause of her death has never been established with certainty. Some historians have suggested angina. Others have proposed tuberculosis. Others still have pointed to cancer, or to the lingering effects of the sweating sickness she had contracted several years earlier. What is certain is that she died before her time, and that her death left a gap in the lives of all who had known and loved her that nothing in the years that followed would ever quite fill. For Eleanor, who was 14 years old, it was the loss of her mother, and in the 16th century, the loss of a mother was a loss of enormous practical as well as emotional significance. Mary had been the centre of the Westhorpe household, the woman whose warmth and character had given the family its particular quality of life. She had been, for Eleanor, not only a mother in the personal sense, but a model, an example of what a woman of rank and intelligence could be, and how she could conduct herself in the world. Without her, things would change in ways that went far beyond the rearrangement of household routines. Mary Tudor's funeral was, as befitted her rank, and the love that her brother the king bore for her, a magnificent and solemn occasion. Her body was embalmed and lay in state at Westhorpe for several weeks, candles burning day and night around the coffin that was draped in blue and black velvet. On the 20th of July, a funeral procession carried her coffin to the Abbey Church at Bury St. Edmunds, where she was laid to rest. Henry VIII ordered a requiem mass to be sung at Westminster Abbey for the repose of his sister's soul, and a delegation from France joined the English mourners to pay their respects to the woman who had, however briefly, been their queen. At the funeral, Eleanor was present. She was 14 years old, and she walked in the procession alongside her elder sister Frances, her younger brother, Henry Brandon, and the other members of the Brandon household. Catherine Willoughby, who was at that time still a ward of the family and would very shortly become Charles Brandon's fourth wife, was also among those who attended. The chief mourner at Mary's funeral was Frances, the elder daughter, the one already moving toward the more prominent public role she would play in the years ahead. Eleanor walked beside her, as she had always walked beside her, the younger sister, slightly behind, in the shadow of the one who went before. It was a solemn and formal occasion, as Tudor funerals always were. The procession, the ceremony, the masses, the black-draped figures moving through the English countryside. Eleanor walked through all of it, and we must imagine her doing so with the particular combination of grief and composure that the Tudor world required of those it placed in positions of formal mourning. The outward form was always more important in the rituals of that world than the inward feeling. Whatever Eleanor felt, whatever grief or fear or bewilderment was moving through her on that July day in 1533, she would have been expected to walk steadily, to hold her head properly, to perform her part in the ceremonial of her mother's passing with the dignity her rank demanded. Her father, Charles Brandon, would not attend the funeral of his wife. This absence was noted at the time and has been remarked upon by historians since. Whether it reflected the depth of his grief, whether he was too overwhelmed to be present, or whether it reflected something cooler and more pragmatic in his character, is difficult to say with any certainty. Brandon was a man of considerable emotional complexity, capable of great loyalty and also capable of a certain ruthlessness when his interests required it. He had loved Mary Tudor deeply and genuinely. Of that there is little doubt. But he had also, in the months before her death, already been considering his own future, and very shortly after Mary's death, he would marry Catherine Willoughby, who was, at the time of the wedding, only 14 years old. This marriage was, by any reckoning, a startling one. Catherine Willoughby had been a ward of the Brandon household and had originally been contracted to marry Eleanor's brother Henry, the young Earl of Lincoln. When Henry died in March of 1534, barely a year after his mother, Brandon transferred the match to himself, taking his late son's intended bride as his own wife. The speed of the remarriage and the circumstances surrounding it were remarked upon by contemporaries with varying degrees of disapproval. There was something almost unseemly in the efficiency of it, the way in which the 16-year-old ward of the household, who had been intended for the son, was redirected so swiftly to the father. For Eleanor, these events, the death of her mother, the death of her brother, and her father's swift remarriage to a woman only a few years older than herself, constituted a dramatic and disorienting rearrangement of her world. Within the space of less than 2 years, she had lost the two most intimate members of her family. She had lost her mother, the woman who had been the emotional and moral centre of the Westhorpe household. She had lost her younger brother, the boy who had carried the Brandon name and title, who had represented the family's male future, and whose death had removed a companion from Eleanor's world, as well as an heir from her father's. And she had gained a stepmother who was barely older than she was, a young woman thrust abruptly into a role of formal authority in a household she had known only as a dependent and a ward. What Eleanor felt about all of this, what went on inside that quiet, observant mind during the winter of 1533 and the month that followed, the historical record does not tell us. She left no diary, no memoir, no record of her interior life beyond the single letter that would survive from the very end of her years. We can only imagine the grief, the disorientation, the quiet effort of continuing to function in a world that had changed so suddenly and so irrevocably. We can only imagine what it meant to walk into a house that still carried the ghost of her mother's presence, the rooms she had occupied, the gardens she had tended, the routines she had established, and to do so in the knowledge that the centre of that world was gone. But life, as it always does, moved forward. Eleanor was still betrothed to Henry Clifford. The marriage contract that had been signed in the spring of 1533, the spring that had also brought her mother's final illness, still stood. The plans that had been made for her future were still in place, and as 1534 gave way to 1535, those plans began to move toward their fulfillment. By 1535, Eleanor Brandon was approximately 16 years old enough, by the standards of the Tudor age, to be formally married. The years since her betrothal had brought loss and upheaval, but they had also, presumably, brought her into some kind of contact with the Clifford family into which she was to marry. Whether she had met Henry Clifford often in the intervening years, whether they had exchanged letters or spent time together at court, is not recorded. The gap between the signing of the contract in March 1533 and the solemnization of the marriage in June 1535, a gap of more than 2 years, was in part a consequence of the upheavals of those years: the death of Eleanor's mother, the death of her brother, the rearrangement of her father's household. For a marriage of this significance, with a bereaved bride in a family still adjusting to so many recent losses, it made sense to allow some time before the ceremony. What occupied Eleanor in those 2 years, how she lived, where she resided, what she thought and felt and hoped, the historical record does not preserve in any detail. We can assume that she continued, for at least part of this period, to live within the Brandon household, now under the management of her stepmother, Catherine Willoughby. We can assume that she occasionally visited court, as daughters of the high nobility typically did. We can assume that she knew, with increasing clarity as the months passed, that the day of her marriage was approaching, that she was moving, step by step, toward the great transition that would take her from the world of her childhood into the entirely different world of the North. But the day of the marriage arrived, and with it, a ceremony of considerable significance. The wedding of Lady Eleanor Brandon and Henry Clifford, Lord Clifford, took place in June of 1535. What makes this occasion notable, beyond the simple fact of its occurrence, is the presence of one particular guest. Among those who attended the wedding ceremony was Eleanor's uncle, King Henry VIII of England. The king's attendance was not merely a courtesy or a formality. It was a statement of interest, of approval, and of the importance he attached to the Brandon family and their affairs. Henry VIII did not attend the weddings of insignificant people. He was not a man who made casual appearances at events that did not warrant his presence. His presence at Eleanor's marriage was a mark of the regard, possibly, as that Jesuit writer would later suggest, something close to genuine affection, that he bore for his niece. It was also, in its way, a public endorsement of the match. By attending the wedding, Henry was signalling to the entire court and the wider world that the Brandon-Clifford alliance had his blessing, that the merging of Tudor blood with the power of the northern Clifford earldom was something the king approved of, supported, and wished to be seen to support. For the Clifford family, whose patriarch had spent so much money and effort preparing his castle and his household for this occasion, the royal presence was the confirmation of everything they had invested in. They had bought, through their daughter-in-law, a connection to the crown so close that the crown itself had come to witness the making of it. The wedding itself, as was customary for weddings of this rank, would have been conducted with appropriate ceremony, vows exchanged in the presence of witnesses, a formal feast, perhaps music and dancing, the various rituals by which the Tudor aristocracy marked the great transitions of life. Eleanor, in her wedding clothes, standing beside the tall, studious young man who was to be her husband, would have been the center of attention for a day. There would have been toasts to the health of the bride and groom, and speeches celebrating the union of two great families, and perhaps some dancing in the great hall as the evening stretched on. And then the real work of her new life would begin. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the emotional reality of this transition, on what it meant for a 16-year-old girl who had lost her mother 3 years earlier to be formally handed from the care of one family into the hands of another. The Tudor marriage ceremony was, in its formal language, a moment of transfer. The bride was given by her father or guardian to the groom. She moved from one household to another, from one set of obligations and expectations to a new set, in a ceremony that was both a beginning and an ending. Whatever Eleanor felt as she stood in that ceremony, whatever mixture of apprehension and hope and grief and acceptance moved through her, she emerged from it as Lady Clifford, wife of the heir to the earldom of Cumberland, mistress of a castle she had not yet seen. Henry Clifford, 1st Earl of Cumberland, Eleanor's father-in-law, had been determined that his family home should be worthy of the new countess who was coming to inhabit it. He was a man who understood, with absolute clarity, what it meant for his house to receive a Tudor bride, and he had taken steps to ensure that the physical setting of that bride's new life reflected the honor she was bringing to his family. In anticipation of Eleanor's arrival at the family's principal seat, he had undertaken a program of significant building work at Skipton Castle in Yorkshire. Skipton Castle was an ancient and imposing structure. Its origins stretch back to the years after the Norman conquest, and it had been in the Clifford family's possession since the early 14th century. By the time Eleanor came to live there, it was a fortress of considerable substance, set within the Yorkshire landscape with a permanence and solidity that spoke of deep roots and long continuity. But the first Earl of Cumberland wanted it to be more than simply solid and ancient. He wanted it to be beautiful, or at least comfortable, a place fit for a woman who had grown up in the cultured households of the Tudor court. And so, as accounts from the period record, he added to the castle 2 new towers and a great gallery, long, light-filled spaces in which the new countess and her household could walk and talk and gather in a manner befitting a woman of her rank. The Cliffords had sold some of their estates, it was noted, to help pay for both the building work and the considerable expense of the wedding itself. This was a measure of the seriousness with which the first Earl took the occasion. He was investing in his family's future, in the Tudor connection that would elevate the Clifford name to something it had never quite been before. And he was, in the process, spending money he could not easily afford, because the prize he was purchasing was, in his estimation, worth every penny. For Eleanor herself, the move from Suffolk to Yorkshire was a journey from one world to another. Westhorpe Hall had been a place of soft landscapes and relatively mild climate, a country house set within the gentle, well-farmed countryside of East Anglia. Skipton was something entirely different. Yorkshire, in the 16th century, was a landscape of dramatic contrasts, of high moors stretching away under enormous skies, of deep dales carved by rivers running brown with peat, of cold winters and unpredictable weather, and of a people who were, in their temperament and their culture, distinct from the population of the south. The north of England was, in many ways, a different country from the south, more conservative in its religious sympathies, more feudal in its social organization, more wary of the changes that were being imposed upon it from the distant court at Westminster. The contrast between the world Eleanor was leaving and the world she was entering would have been felt immediately. The soft Suffolk light was replaced by the harder, more changeable light of the Yorkshire moors. The gentle rivers of East Anglia gave way to the fierce, peaty rivers of the Pennines. The cultivated gardens and parks of Westhorpe gave way to the wild, open country of the north, where the horizon was never more than a walk away, and the sky seemed to occupy a greater portion of the world than it did in the gentler south. Eleanor was moving into a landscape that was magnificent in its own way, genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful on the right kind of day, but that was also harsher, more demanding, more indifferent to human comfort than anything she had known before. Into this world, Eleanor Brandon arrived as a young bride of 16, carrying with her the weight of her Tudor blood and the expectations of 2 powerful families. The castle she came to inhabit was impressive, but it was also, in the way of northern castles, somewhat austere in its essential character. The new gallery that her father-in-law had built was a concession to comfort and civility, a space that acknowledged the southern gentlewoman's sensibilities that Eleanor carried with her. But beyond the walls of the castle, the world was wild and old and full of a history that was not Eleanor's own. We know that Eleanor and Henry Clifford also spent time, in the early years of their marriage, at Brougham Castle in Cumbria, another Clifford property, set in the valley of the River Amont, near the town that is now Penrith. Brougham was, if anything, even more remote and evocative than Skipton, a castle of great age, surrounded by a landscape of fells and rivers, with the great ranges of the Lake District visible in the distance. It was a place of real beauty, but also of real isolation. What was the nature of Eleanor's marriage? The historical record is, as in so many aspects of her life, frustratingly sparse. We do not have detailed accounts of her daily life, her conversations with her husband, her relationships with the Clifford family, or her feelings about the great transformation that had brought her from Suffolk to Yorkshire. What we have are glimpses, fragments of evidence that allow us to construct with reasonable confidence something of the shape of her married life, without giving us the kind of rich, textured detail that we might wish for. What we can say, with some confidence, is that the marriage does not appear to have been an unhappy one. The one surviving letter that Eleanor wrote, a document that will come to occupy an important place in our story later, addresses her husband as dear heart, an expression of genuine warmth and affection that was, even by the emotional vocabulary of the Tudor period, a term of real intimacy. She signs herself, your assured loving wife, a formulaic phrase, certainly, but one that carries, in the context of her letter, something more than mere convention. She is writing to him in a moment of fear and illness, and the language she uses is the language of genuine reliance and genuine feeling. Henry Clifford, for his part, left a mark on the record through his behaviour as a husband that, while indirect, suggests something similar. When Eleanor died, in the autumn of 1547, the histories tell us that he went into something of a personal decline, that the loss affected him deeply, and that he buried his wife in Skipton church, alongside the 2 infant sons they had lost. These are not the actions of a man indifferent to his wife's fate, whatever the complexities of their union, and in the Tudor world, all marriages had complexities. There is reason to believe that Eleanor and Henry Clifford found, within the walls of their northern castles, something that was genuinely warm and genuinely shared. There was also, in the early years of their marriage, the matter of what Henry Clifford made of his new status as the husband of a Tudor niece. The historical record gives us one telling detail, that in the years following his marriage to Eleanor, Henry Clifford marked the elevation of his family's fortunes by extending and improving Skipton Castle further, adding an octagonal tower and long gallery, as the sources specify. He was, in other words, building. He was making visible, in the most literal and permanent way available to him, the transformation that Eleanor's arrival had brought to the Clifford house. He was constructing in stone and timber a testament to the honour his marriage had conferred. It is not a romantic gesture in any conventional sense of the word, but it is, in its own way, a kind of declaration, a permanent mark on the landscape saying, something extraordinary happened here. The early months of 1536 brought Eleanor Brandon to one of the most public moments of her entire life, a moment that placed her, briefly, at the very centre of Tudor affairs, performing a role that was as significant as it was poignant. Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had been Henry VIII's first queen for nearly a quarter of a century, died on the 7th of January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle in Huntingdonshire. She was 50 years old, and the final years of her life had been years of extraordinary suffering. Stripped of her title, separated from her beloved daughter Mary, denied the recognition that she believed, with every fibre of her being, was her rightful due as Henry's lawful wife. She had refused, to the very end, to accept the king's rejection of her, or to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as his legitimate queen. She had signed her final letters not as Catherine of Aragon, Princess Dowager of Wales, the title to which Henry's court insisted she was entitled, but as Catherine the Queen. Her death was, for many people across England and Europe, a moment of genuine grief. Catherine had been a popular queen, respected for her learning, admired for her piety, and loved by many ordinary English people who saw in her a figure of dignity and endurance. But it was also, for Henry VIII, a moment of considerable relief. With Catherine gone, the most persistent thorn in the side of his marital arrangements had been removed. There would be no more legal complications, no more awkward questions about the validity of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. The funeral of Catherine of Aragon was held at Peterborough Cathedral at the end of January 1536, and it was to this occasion that Eleanor Brandon was summoned to play a significant role. She was appointed as the chief mourner at the funeral service. This was not a minor or incidental honour. The chief mourner at a royal or near-royal funeral was the person who walked closest to the coffin, who received the formal condolences of the assembled nobility, and who embodied, in the ceremonial language of the Tudor court, the grief of the departed person's family and circle. It was a position that carried real significance, and it was not given carelessly. Why was Eleanor chosen for this role? The most natural person to serve as chief mourner for Catherine of Aragon, the woman closest to her by a family connection, would have been her daughter, the Lady Mary, Henry's eldest child from the marriage. But Mary was barred from attending the funeral. Henry VII, who still regarded his daughter as an obstinate and recalcitrant presence in his court, refused to allow her to be present at her mother's burial. Mary's insistence on upholding her own claim to legitimacy and her refusal to acknowledge the validity of her father's second marriage had placed her in a position of semi-disgrace from which Henry would not permit her to emerge for an occasion that might be turned into a demonstration of solidarity with the old queen. And so the task fell to Eleanor. She was the niece of the king, and she was the daughter of Mary Tudor, who had been, in her lifetime, one of Catherine of Aragon's closest friends and most loyal supporters. Eleanor's presence at the funeral was, in a sense, a proxy for all of that earlier friendship, a reminder of the bond that had existed between the Queen of France and the Queen of England, and a way of honouring Catherine's memory through the family that had loved her. The imperial ambassador at the English court, Eustace Chapuis, a man who kept meticulous records of all that he observed, noted the occasion in his dispatches to the Emperor Charles III. He identified the chief mourner at Catherine's funeral service as Lady Eleanor, daughter of the Duke of Suffolk and the French Queen, and niece of King Henry. It is a brief, formal entry in the diplomatic correspondence of the period, but it is a primary source confirmation of Eleanor's presence and role that has survived nearly 500 years to reach us today. The funeral at Peterborough must have been a strange and somewhat contradictory experience for Eleanor. She was mourning a woman whose death had, in some ways, been brought about by the actions and decisions of her own family, her uncle being the man most directly responsible for Catherine's suffering. She was standing in for a cousin who had been barred from honouring her own mother, and she was doing so in a formal ceremonial capacity that required her to maintain composure and dignity in circumstances that were anything but straightforward. Let us take a moment to think about what that ceremony would actually have looked like, what Eleanor's experience of that day at Peterborough would have been like in its physical and emotional reality. The funeral procession from Kimbolton Castle, where Catherine had died, to Peterborough Cathedral would have been a journey of some miles across the winter landscape of the English Midlands. The cortege would have moved slowly, as such processions always did, the coffin borne on a hearse draped in black velvet and set about with candles and heraldic devices, preceded and followed by attendants in mourning dress, with the chief mourner walking directly behind the coffin in the position of closest formal grief. Eleanor, in that position, would have been visible to everyone who watched the procession pass. She was a young woman barely 17 or 18 years old, walking in the dead of winter through the English countryside, performing a role of great public solemnity in a ceremony whose political overtones were unmistakable to everyone present. Catherine had died as the Princess Dowager, officially divorced, officially demoted, officially set aside. Her funeral was not a full royal funeral in the strict ceremonial sense. It was a funeral appropriate to a queen who had been declared not a queen. The distinction was deliberate, and it was noticed. The fact that Henry VIII sent no representative of high rank to the funeral, that the highest-ranking Tudor present was his niece Eleanor, rather than any of the great officers of state, was itself a statement. The king was honouring Catherine's memory in the most minimal way consistent with her former status, and no more. Eleanor's presence, whatever personal meaning it carried for her, was also performing a political function, providing just enough royal-adjacent dignity to the occasion to prevent it from being seen as an outright insult to the memory of a woman who had been queen for nearly 25 years, while not providing so much that it suggested any lingering royal acknowledgement of her claims. We have no record of what Eleanor felt on that day. We know only that she performed her role, that she walked in the procession, that she stood at the head of the mourners, that she embodied, for the benefit of the assembled court and the watching world, the formal grief of the Tudor family for the woman they had put aside. And then she returned north, to Skipton, to the life she was making in the cold and beautiful country that had become her home. Her sister Frances, it has been noted, did not attend Catherine of Aragon's funeral in any significant capacity. It has been suggested that Frances may have been pregnant at the time, which would have precluded her presence. Whatever the reason, it was Eleanor who stood at the head of the mourners, Eleanor who received the formal expressions of grief on behalf of the family, Eleanor who marked, in her quiet and dutiful way, the passing of a queen who had deserved better than she received. The fact that Eleanor served as chief mourner for Catherine of Aragon tells us something important about her character and her sympathies. Her mother had been close to Catherine. By all indications, Eleanor herself was close to the memory and the cause of the discarded queen, sympathetic to her suffering, respectful of her dignity. It is notable, as historians have observed, that Eleanor does not appear to have served in the households of most of Henry VIII's subsequent queens, a pattern that suggests she may have been regarded, in the shifting political atmosphere of the court, as belonging to the older, more conservative, Catholic sympathetic faction of the Tudor world. She served eventually in the household of Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, a Protestant-leaning woman of considerable learning and kindness. But between Catherine of Aragon and Catherine Parr, Eleanor seems to have kept largely to the north. The summer and autumn of 1536 brought to the north of England one of the most dramatic and dangerous upheavals of Henry VIII's entire reign. It was called the Pilgrimage of Grace, and it was the largest popular rebellion that Tudor England would ever see. To understand what happened and why, we need to understand what was happening across the English religious landscape in the years leading up to the autumn of 1536. Henry VIII's break with Rome had not been a simple or painless event. It had been a revolution, slow at first, but gathering speed year by year, that was transforming the structure of English religious life in ways that many people found profoundly disturbing and deeply wrong. The dissolution of the monasteries, which had begun in 1536 with the suppression of the smaller houses, was an act of breathtaking destructiveness to the communities that had, for centuries, depended upon the monasteries for spiritual guidance, for education, for charity, and for the simple comfort of the familiar rhythms of religious life. In the north of England, these changes struck with particular force. The north was, in its religious temperament, more conservative than the south. The old faith, the Catholic faith, with its saints and its prayers and its monasteries and its ancient rhythms, was woven deeply into the texture of northern life. The dissolution of the monasteries was not, in the north, an abstract political event. It was the destruction of institutions that people had known and loved all their lives, that their parents and grandparents had known and loved, that had stood as landmarks in the landscape for hundreds of years. And so, the North rose. In October of 1536, tens of thousands of men, not only labourers and farmers, but knights, gentlemen and clergy, took up arms beneath the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ, calling themselves pilgrims engaged in a holy cause. They demanded that Henry VIII reverse the dissolution of the monasteries, restore the Pope's authority over the English Church, and dismiss the heretical advisers who, they believed, had led their king into such disastrous error. The movement spread with remarkable speed through Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cumberland, Westmoreland, and the other northern counties. By the time its full scope became apparent, the Crown was facing an armed force that numbered somewhere between 30 and 50,000 men, vastly outnumbering the forces available to Henry's government in the north. For Eleanor Brandon, now Eleanor Clifford, Countess of Cumberland, this rebellion was not a distant political event that she could observe with safety from behind the walls of a secure palace. It was something that arrived with terrifying immediacy at the very gates of her world. The Clifford family found themselves in an extremely difficult position as the rebellion gathered force. Henry Clifford, Eleanor's husband, was the son and heir of the first Earl of Cumberland, a man who held royal office as Warden of the West Marches and Governor of Carlisle Castle. His father was the King's man in the north, and his loyalties were firmly aligned with the Crown. When the rebellion broke out, there was never any question of the Cliffords joining the Pilgrims. They would stand with the King. But that decision, the right decision, the loyal decision, placed them in immediate and serious danger. As the rebellion spread and the numbers of the Pilgrims grew, it became clear that Skipton Castle was in the direct path of the gathering storm. The rebels were moving through Yorkshire with considerable force and considerable anger, and the castle of a royal official who had publicly refused to join their cause was an obvious target. The first Earl of Cumberland, who was in command at Skipton, began to take measures to fortify the castle against the threat of attack. It was in these circumstances that a fateful decision was made about Eleanor's safety. With Skipton being prepared for a potential siege, Eleanor was considered too vulnerable to remain in the castle. Her father-in-law arranged for her to be taken, along with her young son, presumably the child who would later be identified as one of the infant boys who died before reaching adulthood, and 2 of his daughters, Eleanor's sisters-in-law, to Bolton Abbey. Bolton was a monastery set some 10 miles from Skipton in the Wharfdale Valley, a beautiful, peaceful place that it was hoped would be sufficiently removed from the centre of the gathering danger to keep the women and child safe. It was a reasonable plan, and it almost worked. Almost. By the 22nd of October, 1536, Skipton Castle was under siege. The rebels had surrounded it and were pressing against its walls, demanding that the Earl yield and join their cause. The siege would last for 5 days, until the 27th of October, when the Pilgrims abandoned the attempt and moved south toward Doncaster, where negotiations with the King's representative would eventually produce a temporary truce. But before the siege was lifted, and while the castle was still surrounded, the rebels learned where Eleanor had gone. They came to Bolton Abbey. They forced their way in, and they took Eleanor, along with her young son and her 2 sisters-in-law, captive. The message that the rebels then sent to Eleanor's father-in-law at Skipton was brutal in its simplicity. If the Earl did not surrender the castle to them, Eleanor and the other women would be handed over to the rebel camp followers. The threat was not stated explicitly in all surviving accounts, but its meaning was understood by everyone who heard it. Eleanor, a young woman barely 17 years old, a granddaughter of Henry VII and a niece of the reigning king, was being used as a hostage, her safety leveraged against the military decisions of the men who were supposed to protect her. The terror of those hours at Bolton Abbey is not something that the historical record preserves in any great detail. We do not have Eleanor's own account of what it felt like to be taken captive, to hear the rebel forces outside, to know that her safety, and the safety of her child and her sisters-in-law, depended upon calculations being made by people she could not reach. What we know is what the documents tell us, that she was there, that she was taken, and that the threat against her was real. And then, in the darkness of an October night, help arrived. Christopher Aske was the brother of Robert Aske, the gentleman lawyer who was leading the Pilgrimage of Grace. He was also a cousin and financial receiver of the Earl of Cumberland, a man who was, in other words, caught between the loyalties of family, the loyalties of his employer, and the extraordinary circumstance of a rebellion led by his own brother. Christopher Aske chose, in the end, to act on behalf of the family that employed him and the cousin who trusted him. He assembled a small party. Accounts mention a vicar, a groom, and a boy, and he went to where Eleanor and her companions were held. He organized their escape from Bolton Abbey, and then, through the darkness of the autumn night, with the moors stretching away around them and the lights of the rebel encampment visible in the distance, he led Eleanor, her child, and the other women on a crossing of the moorland that separated Bolton from Skipton. It was a remarkable act of courage and loyalty. The night journey across the moors, exposed and potentially dangerous, with armed men moving through the countryside in all directions, was not a comfortable or safe undertaking, but it succeeded. Eleanor and her companions reached the walls of Skipton Castle. They were inside when the siege was finally lifted 5 days later. Eleanor's husband, meanwhile, had been elsewhere during the worst of the crisis. He had gone to Carlisle, where he was helping to organize the defense of the city against the rebel forces pressing in from that direction. He was performing his duty as a loyal servant of the crown, just as his father was doing at Skipton. When the rebellion finally faded and the immediate danger passed, when the truce at Doncaster was concluded and the pilgrims dispersed, the full picture of what had happened came together. The siege, the capture, the night escape, the hostage threat. Eleanor had survived it, but the experience left its mark. The historical record suggests that she suffered from ill health in the period following the Pilgrimage of Grace, that the fear and the exposure and the hardship of those October days had taken a physical toll that was not quickly recovered from. The woman who had walked across the moors in the dark, clutching her infant son and trusting to the guidance of a man she barely knew, did not return from that experience unchanged. After the storms of 1536, after the funeral of a queen, after the terror of a rebellion, after the night crossing of the moors, Eleanor's life entered a period of comparative quietude that is, perhaps inevitably, the least well-documented part of her story. The years between 1536 and the middle 1540s left few traces in the historical record. There were no great public events, no dramatic crises of the kind that generate the letters and dispatches and diplomatic reports that historians rely upon. There was only life, the daily, private, domestic life of a noblewoman in her castle, doing the things that noblewomen did, in a northern landscape that was, for better or for worse, her world. And yet this quietude, this long undocumented stretch of Eleanor's adult life, was not, in any meaningful sense, uneventful. The events that shaped it were simply private rather than public. They happened in rooms that no ambassador was watching, in moments that no chronicler thought worth recording. They happened in the way that most of the most significant things in most human lives happen, quietly, privately, without witnesses who thought to write them down. We know that Eleanor and Henry continued to live primarily at Skipton Castle, with periods spent at Brougham Castle in Cumbria. Skipton was the more substantial of the two properties, the great castle that had been rebuilt and embellished in anticipation of Eleanor's arrival, that carried the full weight of the Clifford family's history and identity. It stood at the edge of the market town of Skipton, and its towers and battlements would have been a familiar sight to everyone who lived in that part of Yorkshire. The castle was not simply a home. It was a statement, a declaration of the Clifford family's power and permanence, a visible reminder in stone and mortar of their deep roots in the northern landscape. The town of Skipton itself, in Eleanor's day, was a busy, working market town, the kind of settlement that served as the commercial and social hub for the farming communities and the gentry families of the surrounding countryside. There would have been a market on the high street, a church at the heart of the town, inns where travellers rested and merchants bargained, and the steady rhythms of rural English life playing out in all their seasonal variation. Eleanor would have known this town, would have moved through it, or watched it from the castle walls for the better part of a decade. Brougham was perhaps more intimate, a castle of considerable age and beauty, set in a landscape of extraordinary natural grandeur, but somewhat smaller and less commanding in its physical presence. The river Amon ran near its walls, clear and quick over the stones of its bed, and on clear days, the distant fells of the Lake District would have been visible from the upper floors, great masses of hill and cloud, ancient and indifferent, existing on a scale that made all human concerns seem briefly small. An inventory of Skipton Castle, made in 1572, some 25 years after Eleanor's death, includes, among its listings, a chest of clothing that appears to have belonged to her. The contents of this chest have a vividness that the historical record rarely offers us in connection with Eleanor. Gowns of black damask, of black velvet laid with parchment lace, of purple satin, kirtles of crimson damask and of purple tissue, sleeves of cloth of gold and of black velvet, 11 pairs of velvet shoes, green and red and white. It is a small, precise domestic detail, and it brings Eleanor briefly to life in a way that the larger events of her story cannot quite manage. She owned beautiful things. She dressed with the care and the conscious elegance that her rank required. She was, in the fashion of her world, a woman of cultivated tastes who took her appearance seriously. Those velvet shoes, 11 pairs of them in 3 colours, are, in their own small way, one of the most vivid details that Eleanor's story has left us. 11 pairs, green and red and white. She was a young woman who owned beautiful shoes in several colours, who kept them in a chest in a Yorkshire castle, who moved through the rooms and courtyards of Skipton in them. It is the kind of detail that history usually swallows whole, and the fact that it survived, preserved in a dry inventory written more than 2 decades after Eleanor's death, feels somehow like a small and unexpected act of justice. The most significant events of these middle years were the births of her children and the deaths of most of them. Eleanor and Henry Clifford had 3 children during their marriage. The eldest, and the only one to survive to adulthood, was a daughter named Margaret, who was born in 1540. Margaret would go on to become Countess of Derby and would, in time, inherit her mother's place in the Tudor succession, a story that reaches its extraordinary conclusion in the events of 1603, which we will come to in due course, but Eleanor also had two sons. Their names were Henry and Charles. Both of them died in infancy. The loss of infant children was, in the 16th century, an experience that was common, horrifyingly common, by the standards of a world accustomed to better odds of survival for its youngest members. The infant mortality rate in Tudor England was devastating. Even in wealthy, well-fed, well-housed families, the first year of life was a gauntlet that many children did not survive. The causes were varied: infection, fever, the mysterious ailments that Tudor medicine could neither name nor treat effectively. But the effect was always the same: a cradle that had briefly held a living child becoming an absence, a space where someone had been and was no longer. And yet the historical fact of that commonality does not, and should not, diminish the reality of the grief. Eleanor buried two sons. She buried them in Skipton Church, where they would later be joined by their mother. She had carried them, given birth to them, perhaps nursed them and held them and watched the early, uncertain weeks of their lives unfold, only to lose them before they were old enough to speak clearly or walk confidently, or know the names of the people who loved them. What this cost her, what it cost Henry Clifford, is not recorded in any document that has survived. It is one of the great silences in a life that has far more silences than voices. We do not know when the boys were born, or in which order. We do not know whether their deaths came close together, or were separated by years. We do not know whether Eleanor was with them when they died, or whether she was in another part of the castle, or whether news reached her by a servant's quiet knock on a door she had been afraid to open. None of this is recorded. All of it happened. What we can say is that the loss of two sons, in a world where the production of male heirs was one of the central and most heavily weighted obligations of a noblewoman's existence, was a loss that carried significance beyond the purely personal. Eleanor had married into the Clifford earldom. She was supposed to provide that earldom with the male heirs who would carry it forward. The two boys who died had been, in that very specific Tudor understanding of things, failures of the body's most fundamental duty. That this framing was cruel and unjust does not mean that Eleanor herself was immune to it. She lived in the world that generated it. The daughter Margaret was the gift that remained. Born in 1540, when Eleanor was approximately 21 years old, Margaret Clifford grew up in the world her mother had made, the world of Skipton Castle and Brougham Castle, of the northern landscape, of the Clifford household, with its steady rhythms and its deep roots in English aristocratic life. She would have been about 7 years old when Eleanor died, and what memories she carried of her mother into the long life she would live after Eleanor's passing, we cannot know with certainty, but there is something moving in the thought of little Margaret, growing up in those cold northern castles, learning the history and the responsibilities of her family, coming gradually to understand that her mother had been someone important, and that she herself, through the accident of blood, had a place in the long story of England's rulers that most people would never have. Eleanor gave her daughter life, and she gave her, through the fact of their shared Tudor blood, a place in the line of succession to the throne of England, a place that would prove, in the tumultuous decades that followed, to be both precious and profoundly dangerous. In the years following the Pilgrimage of Grace, as her children were born and as two of them were buried, Eleanor maintained connections that occasionally brought her back into contact with the wider world of Tudor England. Her stepmother, Catherine Willoughby, the young woman who had come into Eleanor's life as her father's fourth wife, had by this point become one of the most significant Protestant noblewomen in England. Catherine was a woman of considerable intelligence and strong convictions. deeply committed to the Protestant cause and a significant patron of Protestant scholars and reformers. She had navigated the complexities of the Tudor court with remarkable skill, and she remained throughout the years of Eleanor's marriage and motherhood a presence in the family network that connected Eleanor to the world she had grown up in. The relationship between Eleanor and her stepmother appears to have been warm. Despite the oddness of their relationship, despite the fact that Catherine had been barely older than Eleanor when she married Charles Brandon, and had been briefly intended for Eleanor's brother before being transferred, in that somewhat startling transaction, to the father, there is no evidence of hostility or resentment between the two women. Eleanor remained on good terms with Catherine, and this connection may have eased, at least somewhat, the isolation of her northern life. It is worth pausing, in these middle years of Eleanor's story, to think about what daily life in a northern castle actually meant for a woman of her rank and her circumstances. The domestic administration of a great household was a substantial and complex undertaking. Eleanor would have been responsible for the management of the castle's household, overseeing the preparation of food, the maintenance of the castle's linens and furnishings, the management of the servants who kept the establishment running. She would have been expected to entertain guests in a manner appropriate to the Clifford family's status, which meant presiding over meals and receptions with the grace and composure that her breeding had given her. She would also, given the religious climate of the age, have been responsible for the spiritual life of her household, ensuring that prayers were said at the appropriate times, that the chapel was properly maintained, that the devotional practices of the household were kept with appropriate regularity. The question of Eleanor's own religious beliefs is one that the historical record does not resolve clearly. Her presence as chief mourner at Catherine of Aragon's funeral suggests a sympathy with the old faith, or at least with the people who represented it. Her husband's later Catholic sympathies are better documented, but Eleanor's own interior spiritual life, what she believed, how she prayed, what comfort or conflict the great religious upheavals of her age created in her, remains invisible to us. By around 1546, Eleanor appears in the historical record once more, listed as a member of the household of Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. Catherine Parr was a woman of genuine learning and deep Protestant piety, who had managed the extraordinary feat of surviving her marriage to an aging and increasingly dangerous king by combining intellectual engagement with careful political tact. Her household was, by the standards of the Tudor court, a relatively enlightened and civilized place, a gathering of educated women around a thoughtful and bookish queen. Eleanor's presence there, in the final year or so of Henry VIII's life, was perhaps the last significant contact she had with the court that had shaped her earliest years. It was also, in a quietly poignant way, a kind of homecoming. After more than a decade in the north, after the siege of Skipton and the loss of her sons and the long, quiet years of castle life, Eleanor was back, however briefly and however partially, in the world she had been born into. The world of Tudor grandeur and ceremonial and the soft, constant pressure of the king's enormous presence. She moved once more through the gilded rooms and the tapestried galleries of the court, carrying with her the experience of a life that none of the other women around her had quite shared. The experience of the north, of the castles, of the moors, of grief and endurance in a world far from the court's glittering centre. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January, 1547. He was 55 years old, and the manner of his dying was as overwhelming in its physical reality as his manner of living had always been. His body swollen beyond recognition, his legs ulcerated, his lungs failing, his mind moving with decreasing clarity through the fog of illness. the golden king of the early years, the magnificent prince who had danced and jousted and composed music and won battles, had become, by the end of his life, something that the world could barely recognize as the same man. But even in the provisions he made for the world after his death, Henry VIII had not forgotten Eleanor. His will, drawn up and revised in the final years of his life, and incorporating the terms of the Third Succession Act of 1544, placed Eleanor in the line of succession to the throne of England. She was 8th in line at the time the act was passed, behind Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, Frances, Jane Grey, Catherine Grey, and Mary Grey. After Henry's death, with Edward now King Edward VI, she moved to 7th place. It was a position of enormous theoretical significance and of very limited practical relevance. Eleanor was not a political figure in any meaningful sense. She had no court following, no factional support, no network of powerful allies working on her behalf. She was a quiet noblewoman in the north of England, the mother of a surviving daughter and the wife of a Yorkshire earl. But the fact of her place in the succession mattered nonetheless, mattered for what it meant for her daughter Margaret, and for what it would eventually mean for the course of English history in ways that Eleanor, in the autumn of 1547, would never live to see. By the autumn and winter of 1546, and into the early months of 1547, Eleanor Brandon was ill. The nature of her illness is not known with certainty. The Tudor age did not possess either the diagnostic tools or the medical vocabulary to describe illness in the precise terms that we would use today. What they had were symptoms, the physical manifestations of processes that their physicians could observe, but could not, in most cases, understand or effectively treat. Jaundice, fever, pain, the mysterious discoloration of the urine that Eleanor herself, writing with a layperson's anxious intelligence, identified as a sign of something seriously wrong. The medical landscape of Eleanor's world was, by any modern standard, profoundly limited. Tudor physicians worked from a theoretical framework inherited from the ancient world. The theory of the four humours, which attributed illness to imbalances between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment was correspondingly imprecise. Purges, bloodletting, herbal preparations, rest, changes of diet. Some physicians were more skilled and more observant than others, and some treatments were, by accident rather than design, genuinely beneficial. But for serious, systemic illness of the kind that Eleanor's symptoms suggest, jaundice, fever, loss of appetite, pain in the side and back, the Tudor physician was largely powerless. The best he could offer was observation, reassurance, and the most targeted of the remedies his training had given him. Eleanor knew Dr. Stevens. She asked for him by name in her letter, asked that he be sent for specifically, because he knoweth best my complexion for such causes. This is a significant detail. It suggests that Eleanor had a relationship with this physician that went back some time, that he had treated her before, that she trusted him, and that she believed he understood her particular constitution in a way that a stranger would not. The phrase, "for such causes," is also notable. It implies that this was not the first time Eleanor had been ill in this way. She had experienced symptoms like these before. She had recovered from them before, perhaps, and now she feared, with a directness that she could not quite bring herself to express, but that saturates every word of her letter, that this time might be different. The letter is dated the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, a date that, even in the 16th century, carried associations of love and sentiment, of hearts and tender feelings. Eleanor, writing on that day, was not feeling romantic. She was frightened and she was in pain, and she was writing to the person she most needed to reach. The combination of the date and the letter's raw, urgent content creates a kind of pathos that is difficult to resist. Here is a woman writing to her dear heart on the day designated for lovers, not with declarations of affection or pretty verses, but with a plain, detailed account of her failing body and her urgent need for help. What we know comes primarily from this document, the only letter that Eleanor wrote, which has survived to the present day. The letter is dated the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, as the Renaissance English History podcast has observed, with a degree of sad irony, and it was written from Eleanor's lodge at Carlton. It was addressed to her husband Henry, and it is, in every respect, one of the most personal and most human documents that the Tudor age has left us from the life of any woman of Eleanor's rank. It is not a courtly letter. It is not composed in the elaborate, ornate style that Tudor aristocrats typically used when writing for any kind of formal purpose. There are no flowery opening compliments, no careful political calculations wrapped in polished prose, none of the rhetorical performance that characterized so much of the written communication of the period. It is simply a woman speaking directly to her husband, speaking in plain language about plain and frightening things. She tells him that she has been very sick. She tells him that her water is very red, a symptom that she herself interprets with a layperson's anxious logic, as indicating that she has both the jaundice and the ague at the same time. She says she has had no appetite for meat, and that she has such pains in her side and toward her back as she had at Brougham. That phrase, "as I had at Brougham," where it began with me first, suggesting that whatever was afflicting her was not entirely new, that it had an earlier episode, that the body had been sending warnings for some time. She asks him, with a directness that is almost startling in its urgency, to help her find a physician, to send one back with the letter-bearer quickly before the illness progresses further. She says that in the beginning she trusts she may have good remedy, but that the longer it is delayed, the worse it will be. She mentions, almost in passing, that her sister Powys, meaning Anne Brandon, her paternal half-sister who had married Lord Grey of Powys, has come to visit her and is very desirous to see Henry as well. It is a small detail, easy to overlook, but it speaks to Eleanor's world in a particular way. She was not entirely alone. Her half-sister had come to be with her. The family, however dispersed and however altered by the years and the marriages and the deaths, still moved toward its own in times of need. Anne Brandon had come north to be with Eleanor, and Eleanor, in her letter, notes her presence, notes it warmly, with something that reads like quiet gratitude. And then, at the end, she makes one specific, urgent named request. She asks him to send for Dr. Stevens, because he knoweth best my complexion for such causes. She signs it, simply and finally, by your assured loving wife, Eleanor Cumberland. The letter is short, a few hundred words at most, but it contains more of Eleanor's actual voice, her actual self, than anything else that has survived from her life. The dear heart with which she opens her address to her husband, the bluntness with which she describes her symptoms, that direct, medical, almost clinical assessment of what her body is telling her, the urgency beneath the formal surface, the sense that she knows at some level that this is serious, that it is not just a passing distemper, that time matters in a way she cannot afford to ignore. The letter had been written, the request had been made. Whether Henry Clifford received it quickly, whether he sent for the doctor, whether Dr. Stevens came and what he found when he arrived, none of this is recorded. What the historical record tells us is only the outcome, that Eleanor did not recover. She was right to be urgent. She did not get better. Henry VIII had died on the 28th of January, 1547. His niece Eleanor, the girl he had called his favourite, the woman for whose wedding he had made himself a guest, the young bride he had watched go north to the cold castles of the Clifford family, survived him by barely 9 months. On the 27th of September 1547, Eleanor Brandon, Countess of Cumberland, died at Brougham Castle. She was 27, perhaps 28 years old. The same castle that had been mentioned in her last letter, where the illness began with me first, was the place where her life ended. There is something in this detail that feels almost unbearable in its quietness. The illness that killed Eleanor had its beginning at Brougham, and at Brougham, Eleanor died. It should be noted that there is a small discrepancy in the historical sources about the precise date of Eleanor's death. Most modern sources record it as the 27th of September, 1547. However, an account preserved by Eleanor's descendant Anne Clifford, the remarkable 17th century noblewoman, who devoted much of her life to recovering the history and the rights of the Clifford family, gives the date as toward the end of November. Both are secondary sources, and neither can be independently confirmed by a primary death record. The 27th of September is the date that appears most consistently in the historical literature, and it is the date that we use here, while acknowledging the uncertainty. The year 1547 had begun with the death of a king, and ended, for Eleanor, with her own. Henry VIII had died in January, heavy and enormous in his final decline. Eleanor had died in the autumn, young and slight and largely unnoticed. It was a year of ending, a year in which the great Tudor colossus who had shaped Eleanor's entire world was extinguished, and in which the quiet, forgotten niece who had tried to exist on the edges of that world followed him into the silence. Eleanor was buried at Skipton Church, Christ Church, Skipton, the parish church of the family into which she had married, the church where she had perhaps prayed during her years at the castle, the church where her 2 infant sons had already been laid to rest. She joined them there, in the Yorkshire earth, in the autumn of 1547. An account from the 17th century, when Eleanor's tomb in Skipton Church was apparently disturbed during alterations to the building, noted that her skeleton, which was described as being in perfect condition at the time of its discovery, proved her to have been very tall and large-boned. It is a strange, unexpected detail, a physical fact about a woman whose inner life is so largely invisible to us, preserved not in letters or memoirs or portraits, but in the bones that outlasted the flesh and the world that had shaped her. Very tall and large-boned. It is, somehow, not the description one automatically reaches for in imagining Eleanor Brandon. The historical narrative has a tendency, perhaps unconscious, to construct a picture of her as small and quiet, as a figure who moved through the edges of events rather than their centre, who was overlooked because she was easy to overlook. But the bones tell a different story. Eleanor Brandon was a tall woman. She was strongly made. Whatever quietness she carried was a quietness of disposition or circumstance, not of presence. She was, in her physical reality, someone who would have been noticed when she entered a room. Eleanor's death at the age of 27 or 28 left behind a husband who, by the accounts of the period, was genuinely affected by the loss. Henry Clifford, the tall, studious man, who had become Eleanor's dear heart in the private language of their marriage, went into something of a personal decline in the immediate aftermath of her death. He buried her at Skipton Church, alongside the 2 infant sons they had shared, and the weight of those 3 graves, wife and sons, gathered together in a Yorkshire churchyard, must have been considerable. In the months and years that followed Eleanor's death, Henry Clifford's situation changed in the ways that the death of a spouse inevitably changed things for a man of his rank and position in the 16th century. He was a widower with one surviving child, a daughter, Margaret, who was 7 years old. He was the Earl's son and would in due course succeed his father as the second Earl of Cumberland. He had estates to manage, political duties to perform, and a family name to sustain. Henry Clifford would eventually remarry, as noblemen of his rank were expected to do. His second wife was Anne Dacre, the daughter of William Dacre, 3rd Baron Dacre, a woman who was connected to the powerful and ancient Dacre family of the north, who had their own deep roots in the borderlands between England and Scotland. Anne Dacre would bear him a son, George Clifford, who would in time become the 3rd Earl of Cumberland. George Clifford was a remarkable figure in his own right, a man whose career took him far from the cold northern castles that had been Eleanor's world, and into the very heart of Elizabethan maritime adventure. He was appointed the Queen's champion at the annual Accession Day tilts, the ceremonial jousting tournaments at which Elizabeth's courtiers competed for the honour of being her personal champion. And he wore the Queen's favour with a theatrical dash that made him one of the most celebrated figures of the Elizabethan court. He was also a privateer and an explorer, who made no fewer than 12 voyages to the Caribbean and the Spanish Main in pursuit of Spanish ships and Spanish gold. In 1598, he led an expedition that briefly captured the Spanish city of San Juan in Puerto Rico, a remarkable military achievement, even if the English hold on the city proved impossible to maintain for long against the Spanish counterattack that followed. But George Clifford's more lasting legacy was perhaps not his naval adventures, but his domestic ones, or rather, their domestic consequences. His marriage was troubled. He was frequently absent on his voyages, spent extravagantly, and his relationship with his wife Margaret Russell was unhappy. He left his estates in disorder, and when he died in 1605, he bequeathed them not to his daughter Anne Clifford, who was his only surviving child, but to his brother Francis, on the grounds that the earldom should pass through the male line. This decision generated one of the most remarkable legal and personal battles in English history. Anne Clifford, George's daughter, and therefore Eleanor Brandon's great-granddaughter, spent the next 4 decades of her life fighting with extraordinary tenacity and intelligence to recover the inheritance that she believed was rightfully hers. She was twice married to powerful men who tried to dissuade her from pursuing her claim, first to Richard Sackville, Earl of Dorset, and then to Philip Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. Both men were told by James I himself that they should bring their wife to heel and make her abandon her legal challenge to the inheritance settlement. Anne refused both times. She accepted no compromise that was not full recognition of her rights, and she kept records, meticulous, extraordinary records, of her family's history and her own struggles, in a series of diaries and chronicles that constitute one of the most remarkable personal documents of the 17th century. In 1643, after both her husbands and most of her enemies were dead, Anne Clifford finally came into full possession of her northern estates. She was 53 years old, and in the decades that remained to her, she lived until 1676, dying at the age of 86. She devoted herself to the restoration and maintenance of everything her family had built and owned. She rebuilt Skipton Castle. She rebuilt Brougham Castle. She restored Brewer Appleby and Pendragon Castles. She endowed almshouses, maintained churches, and caused to be created at Appleby a stone monument to her mother, a triptych tomb that is one of the finest surviving pieces of funerary art from the period. Anne Clifford is, in her own right, one of the most extraordinary women in English history, but she is also, in the specific context of our story tonight, the woman whose extraordinary tenacity preserved the physical legacy of the world that Eleanor Brandon had inhabited. The castles that Eleanor had lived in, Skipton and Brougham, survived to the present day in large measure because Anne Clifford, Eleanor's great-granddaughter, cared enough about her family's inheritance to fight for it and, having won it, to restore it. Henry Clifford, 2nd Earl of Cumberland, died in January of 1570, more than 20 years after Eleanor. He had lived a long and relatively eventful life, serving the crown faithfully through the turbulent reigns of Edward II, Mary I, and the early years of Elizabeth II. In later life, as historians have noted, he developed increasingly pronounced Catholic sympathies. He was rumoured to be supportive of Catholic priests in his household, and was thought to have looked with some favour upon the Northern Rebellion of 1569, which was in many ways a spiritual successor to the Pilgrimage of Grace that had so dramatically shaped his and Eleanor's early married life. Whether Henry Clifford, in the last years of his life, thought often about Eleanor, about the young woman from Suffolk, who had come north to marry him, who had survived the rebellion alongside him, who had called him dear heart in her last frightened letter, and who was buried with their sons in Skipton Church, we cannot say. The record is silent on that, as it is silent on so much of his inner life. But he had been married to her for 12 years. He had shared with her the years of the Pilgrimage of Grace, the grief of their infant sons' deaths, and the quiet domestic rhythms of castle life in the north. Whatever their marriage had been, and the surviving evidence suggests it had been genuinely warm, it was the shaping relationship of his younger adult life, and its loss had marked him. The castles that had been Eleanor's homes would continue to stand long after both she and Henry were gone, leaving their mark on the history of northern England through the lives of the successive Earls of Cumberland and, most remarkably, through the extraordinary life of Lady Anne Clifford, Henry Clifford's granddaughter, who would spend decades fighting the legal battles necessary to reclaim her family's inheritance, and who would, in the process, restore and record the Clifford family's history with a thoroughness that has proved invaluable to historians of the Tudor and Stuart periods. Eleanor's death in 1547 left her daughter Margaret as the sole surviving heir of both the Brandon blood and the Clifford estate. Margaret was approximately 7 years old when her mother died, old enough to have some memories of Eleanor, young enough for those memories to have the quality of early childhood impressions rather than the detailed recollections of a mature mind. What she carried from those early years in the Clifford castles of the north into the long and complicated life she would live, what she took from her mother's brief, brilliant, and ultimately obscured existence, we cannot know with certainty, but we know that she carried the blood, and the blood in the world that Margaret was growing up into was everything. Margaret Clifford was, through her mother Eleanor, a direct descendant of Henry II, a granddaughter of Mary Tudor, and a great-niece of Henry VIII, according to the provisions of Henry VIII's will and the Third Succession Act of 1544. She was in the line of succession to the throne of England, a position that, in the volatile and often terrifying world of Tudor dynastic politics, was less a privilege than a constant source of danger. Her cousin Edward VI was a child when he became king, and a dying one by the time he was 15. The succession that had seemed, in Henry VIII's careful arrangements, to be settled and orderly, proved in the event to be anything but. Margaret's childhood was spent primarily in the north, under the care of her father Henry Clifford, and eventually of the household he established after Eleanor's death. We know that she received the kind of education appropriate to a girl of her rank and her royal connections. She was noted in later life for her love of literature and of music, which suggests that her early education had cultivated in her the same intellectual and artistic sensibilities that were valued in educated women of the Tudor period. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine feeling, qualities that her mother, so far as we can tell from the sparse record, also possessed. The question of Margaret's marriage was, predictably, a matter of intense interest from the moment her mother died. She was the sole surviving descendant of Eleanor Brandon, and therefore, through the provisions of Henry VIII's will, the continuation of that branch of the Tudor succession. Anyone who married Margaret would be marrying into the line of potential heirs to the English throne. This made her, as it had made her mother before her, a chess piece in the great dynastic games of the Tudor age. The most dramatic of the proposals that were made for Margaret's hand came during the troubled final months of the reign of the young King Edward VI, when the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, who had effectively seized control of the government of England during Edward's minority, was pursuing an ambitious scheme to redirect the succession in favour of the Protestant side of the Tudor family. Northumberland's plan was, essentially, to prevent the Catholic Mary Tudor from inheriting the throne at Edward's death, and to put in her place a young Protestant noblewoman connected to the Suffolk line. His scheme centred primarily on Lady Jane Grey, the eldest daughter of Francis Brandon, who was Eleanor's elder sister and Margaret's own aunt. Jane was to be married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, and named as Edward's successor in the King's Devise, the document by which Edward, guided by Northumberland, attempted to alter the succession in Jane's favour. But Northumberland was also casting his net more widely. At one point, the historical record suggests, he proposed that Margaret Clifford might be married either to his son, Guildford Dudley, or to his brother, Sir Andrew Dudley. This proposal would have brought Margaret, and through her, Eleanor Brandon's line of the succession, directly into Northumberland's scheme for Protestant dynastic control. Margaret's father, Henry Clifford, refused. He would not allow his daughter to be drawn into Northumberland's plans. He would not deliver the Clifford family and the Tudor blood of Eleanor Brandon's descendants into the hands of the Duke who was manoeuvring so aggressively to reshape England's political future. It was a decision of real courage, a refusal to be swept up in the calculations of a powerful and dangerous man, and it proved, in the end, to be entirely correct. When Mary Tudor arrived from East Anglia with her supporters and swept aside Northumberland's scheme, when Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign collapsed and Northumberland was sent to the Tower, the families who had refused to be part of the conspiracy emerged from the crisis with their honour and their freedom intact. The Cliffords had not participated in the attempt to make Jane Grey Queen, and they suffered none of the consequences that fell upon those who had. Margaret Clifford's own marriage took place in February of 1555, when she married Henry Stanley, Lord Strange, in a ceremony at Westminster. Henry Stanley would in time become the 4th Earl of Derby, and his marriage to Margaret united two of the great noble families of England, the Stanleys of Lancashire and the Cliffords of Yorkshire, in a union that was as much about political calculation as it was about anything more personal. Queen Mary I, who was on the throne at the time of the wedding, marked the occasion by presenting Margaret with a gift of considerable value. The jewels and robes that had been confiscated from the Dudley family after Northumberland's fall. It was a generous and pointed gesture, a reminder that the Clifford family had done the right thing in 1553, and a welcome into the favour of the new Catholic Queen. Margaret's life in the years that followed her marriage was shaped by the same paradox that had shaped her mother's existence. Proximity to the royal line was at once an honour and a perpetual source of unease. Under the reign of Elizabeth I, who came to the throne in November of 1558, Margaret's position became increasingly complicated. She was of the wrong religion, or at least suspected of being so, and her royal blood made her, in Elizabeth's eyes, a potential focus for Catholic opposition to the Protestant Queen. Elizabeth was, throughout her reign, acutely and sometimes ruthlessly attentive to anyone who might represent a dynastic alternative to herself, and Margaret Clifford, with her descent from Henry VII, was exactly the kind of person who attracted that attention. The difficulties that Margaret encountered in the years of Elizabeth's reign, the moments when her royal connections brought her into conflict with the crown, the anxiety and the watchfulness that characterized the lives of all those who stood too close to the Tudor succession, form a story that is, as we have noted, worthy of its own telling. What matters for our purposes tonight is the thread that connects Margaret's story to Eleanor's, that Margaret was everything she was in terms of her place in the succession, because Eleanor had given birth to her and because Eleanor's blood had passed through her into a new generation. Margaret Clifford, Countess of Derby, died on the 28th of September, 1596. She had outlived her mother by nearly half a century. She had outlived her husband and her eldest son. She had seen the world of the Tudors transformed beyond recognition, had watched Elizabeth I reign for 38 years, had seen the religious landscape of England shift and shift again, had witnessed the destruction and rebuilding of the world that her grandmother Mary Tudor had known. She died without having recovered royal favour and without having secured for herself or her family the recognition that her Tudor blood might, in another world, have warranted. But she left a granddaughter, and through that granddaughter, the story of Eleanor Brandon was not yet quite finished. The final chapter of Eleanor Brandon's legacy is one of the most quietly remarkable stories in the history of the Tudor succession, a story that reaches its conclusion not in Eleanor's own lifetime, but more than half a century after her death, on the day that Elizabeth I drew her last breath. Elizabeth, I died on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old, and she had been Queen of England for 44 years. She had never married, and she had never named a successor, at least not openly. The question of who would inherit the English throne from a childless queen had haunted her reign from its very beginning, and in the final years of her life, it had become a matter of acute and urgent concern to everyone with any stake in the future of the kingdom. Under the terms of Henry VIII's will, the document that had defined the succession according to his own wishes and the provisions of the Third Succession Act of 1544, the question had, in theory, a clear answer. Henry had passed over the descendants of his elder sister Margaret Tudor in favour of the descendants of his younger sister Mary. Of Mary's daughters, Frances Brandon had died in 1559, and her daughters, Jane, Catherine and Mary Grey, had all died without producing legitimate heirs who could continue the succession unambiguously. Catherine Grey's two sons had been declared illegitimate because her marriage to Edward Seymour had never been formally recognised. Mary Grey had died childless. Jane Grey had been executed. With the Grey line effectively extinct or legally compromised, the succession under Henry VIII's will passed to the descendants of Eleanor Brandon. Eleanor herself had been dead for more than 50 years. Her daughter Margaret Clifford had died in 1596, but Margaret had left children, and those children had left children of their own. The eldest surviving descendant in the direct line, by 1603, was a young woman named Lady Anne Stanley, the eldest daughter of Ferdinando Stanley, 5th Earl of Derby, who had himself been the son of Margaret Clifford, The chain of descent was as follows. Henry VII had a daughter, Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor had a daughter, Eleanor Brandon. Eleanor Brandon had a daughter, Margaret Clifford. Margaret Clifford had a son, Ferdinando Stanley. Ferdinando Stanley had a daughter, Anne Stanley. Through that chain, grandmother to granddaughter to great-granddaughter, the blood of the first Tudor king had passed, generation by generation, to a young woman who, according to the specific and legal terms of her great-great-great-grandfather's will, was the rightful heir to the throne of England. It is worth pausing on Ferdinando Stanley for a moment, because his story adds an additional dimension to the already remarkable narrative of this line of descent. Ferdinando was not a forgotten figure in his own time. He was the 5th Earl of Derby, a man of considerable wealth and cultural patronage, and a man whose Tudor blood, which he inherited through his mother Margaret Clifford, was well known in the political world of late Elizabethan England. He was, in the 1590s, one of the most prominent Protestant noblemen in England, with a legitimate claim to royal blood. He was a patron of theatre and the arts, a man of genuine intellectual distinction, and someone whose name was discussed in certain circles as a possible Protestant successor to Elizabeth. In 1593, Ferdinando was approached by Catholic conspirators who wanted him to lead a challenge to Elizabeth's authority. He rejected the overture and reported it to the Queen's Council. His loyalty was genuine, or at least effectively expressed, but the episode demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, just how politically significant his hereditary position had made him. Ferdinando Stanley died in April of 1594, at the age of 35, of an illness that came on with dramatic and suspicious suddenness. The whispered suggestion of poison was never confirmed. He left behind 3 daughters, Anne, Frances, and Elizabeth. His wife, Alice Spencer, was left to manage the complex legal and financial affairs of the Stanley inheritance. His eldest daughter, Anne, who was 13 years old when her father died, was left with the Tudor blood that had come to her through her father, and through him through Margaret Clifford, and through Margaret through Eleanor Brandon. The historian Connor Byrne, who has written extensively about this line of descent, has made the argument clearly and forcefully that under the terms of Henry VIII's will, Anne Stanley, not James VI of Scotland, was the legal heir to Elizabeth I. James VI was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, and he descended from Henry VII through his elder daughter, Margaret Tudor, rather than through the younger daughter, Mary Tudor. Henry VIII had specifically and deliberately passed over the Scottish line in his will, preferring the English Suffolk line. Under a strict reading of that document, James had no claim. Elizabeth I, however, made a different choice. In the final hours of her life, or in the careful political preparations that had been made in the months and years preceding her death, it was James VI of Scotland who was named as her successor. He came south to claim his throne, was crowned James I of England, and the Stuart dynasty began. England and Scotland were united under a single monarch, and the Suffolk line, the line that ran from Mary Tudor through Frances Brandon and Eleanor Brandon, was quietly and permanently set aside. Anne Stanley was 22 years old in 1603. She was, by virtually all accounts, never seriously considered a realistic candidate for the throne, even by those who knew about her legal claim. James was male, Protestant, already a proven king in Scotland, the father of children, and backed by a network of political support that Anne Stanley could not even begin to match. The logic of the succession, as it actually operated in the real world of 1603, was not the logic of Henry VIII's will, but the logic of power, personality, and practical politics. James was the right man in the right place at the right moment, And England, exhausted by the uncertainty of Elizabeth's long childless reign, accepted him with relief. It is possible to construct an argument, and some historians have done so, that Elizabeth's choice of James was not entirely unreasonable, even on legal grounds. The Third Succession Act of 1544 had been superseded in some respects by later legislation, and the legal validity of Henry VIII's will was itself a subject that could be, and was, debated. James also had his own claim through the Stuart line, and many English lawyers and politicians of 1603 were content to argue that the right of succession followed blood more naturally than it followed the specific provisions of a document written half a century earlier by a king who was no longer alive to enforce it. The whole question of who was legally rightful heir in 1603 is one that English constitutional lawyers could debate at considerable length, and have. But the legal fact remains. Anne Stanley, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Eleanor Brandon, was, by one clear and defensible reading of the law as Henry VIII had laid it down, the rightful Queen of England in 1603, and she was never given the chance to be anything of the kind. Anne Stanley would go on to live a long and relatively quiet life as a member of the English nobility. She married Grey Bridges, 5th Baron Chandos, and later married Mervyn Touchet, 2nd Earl of Castlehaven. She outlived the entire Stuart dynasty's first generation, living to see James III's son Charles and come to the throne, and the great constitutional crisis of the Civil War begin to gather. She died in 1647, at the age of 67, in a world that had changed almost beyond recognition since the year of her birth. Whether she ever thought about what might have been, whether the knowledge of her legal claim ever sat with her as a weight or a wonder or simply an irrelevance, the historical record does not tell us. There is a kind of quiet justice, or perhaps a quiet injustice in this. Eleanor Brandon had been overlooked, in life and in death, in favour of more prominent and more dramatic figures. Her sister Frances was more ambitious, more politically active, more central to the great dramas of the mid-Tudor period. Her nieces, Jane, Catherine and Mary Grey, were more visible, more dangerous, more caught up in the great struggles over the Protestant succession. Eleanor herself had retreated north to her castles and her gardens and her grief, and had lived a life that the court largely forgot to notice. And then, 50 years after her death, her line produced the legal heir to England's throne, and England looked the other way. Before we close our story tonight, there are a few last fragments of Eleanor Brandon that deserve our attention. Small, specific, and oddly touching details that bring her into focus one final time. The first concerns a portrait. There is a painting attributed to the Tudor artist Hans Eworth, and now held in the National Portrait Gallery in London, that has been associated with Eleanor Brandon. The painting shows a woman of some status and presence, dressed in the manner of the mid-16th century, and bears in its upper left corner the impaled arms, the heraldic device that represents the joint households of husband and wife, of Henry Clifford, 2nd Earl of Cumberland, and his wife Lady Eleanor. The problem is that the painting appears to date from between 1565 and 1568, 18 to 21 years after Eleanor's death in 1547. A portrait of Eleanor herself, painted at the time she actually lived, would predate these years. Some art historians and curators have suggested that the painting may actually represent Margaret Clifford, Eleanor's daughter, who would have been between 25 and 28 at the time of the portrait's creation. The National Portrait Gallery has identified the sitter as Lady Eleanor, but the Tate has expressed doubts, and the question remains, as Wikipedia's article on Eleanor states plainly, in dispute. It is a fitting ambiguity. Eleanor Brandon was a woman whose identity was throughout her life, perpetually at risk of being subsumed by more prominent figures. Her mother, her sister, her nieces, her husband's family. Even the portrait that is most commonly associated with her may not, in fact, be of her at all. It may be her daughter. The confusion between the two is itself, in a small but telling way, a kind of summary of Eleanor's story. The woman who was always being mistaken for someone else, or overlooked in favour of someone else, persists even in the uncertain attribution of the one image that might be her face. The second detail is the skeleton. When Eleanor's tomb in Skipton Church was disturbed in the 17th century during building alterations, her remains were examined. The skeleton, described as being in perfect condition, was noted by those who saw it as evidence that Eleanor had been, in physical terms, very tall and large-boned. It is a striking, specific physical fact, entirely at odds with the delicate, small-scale image of a Tudor woman that we might unconsciously have formed from the general culture of the period. Eleanor Brandon was tall. She was strongly built. She was, in her physical presence, perhaps something more imposing than the quiet, retiring figure that her historical invisibility might suggest. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that what the 17th century preserved from Eleanor's tomb was not an inscription, not a piece of jewellery, not a record of prayers said or masses sung, but a simple physical observation. She was tall and large-boned. The bones outlasted everything else, outlasted the church furnishings, the memorial brasses, the painted images, the spoken prayers, and the bones said, in their silent physical way, that Eleanor Brandon had occupied space, that she had been present, that whatever quietness of disposition she may have carried through her life, the woman herself had been solid and real and substantial in the world. And then there is the letter, that single surviving piece of paper, the Valentine's Day letter written from Carlton, addressed to her dear heart, asking him to send for Dr. Stevens. It is the only place in the entire historical record where Eleanor Brandon speaks to us directly, in her own voice, without any mediating presence. And what she says, when she speaks, is not a grand statement about history or succession or the great events of the Tudor age. She says that she is sick. She says that she is frightened. She says that she needs help, and she asks the man she loves to provide it. In that directness, in that plainness, in the complete absence of the rhetorical performance that characterizes most Tudor correspondence, Eleanor Brandon is more present than she is in any other document that has survived from her life. She does not try to impress us, or reassure us, or perform for an audience beyond the one man she is writing to. She simply says what is happening to her, as clearly and as honestly as she can. And in that simple honesty, in that small, frightened, clear-eyed letter, she becomes, across 5 centuries, someone we can almost know. It is, in the end, the most human thing in her entire story, and the most enduring. Eleanor Brandon, later Eleanor Clifford, Countess of Cumberland, was born in 1519 and died in 1547. She lived for approximately 27 or 28 years. She was the daughter of a Queen of France and the niece of a King of England. She was the granddaughter of the first Tudor monarch. She mourned a queen that her own cousin was not permitted to mourn. She survived one of the greatest rebellions of the Tudor age. She bore 3 children and buried 2 of them. She wrote one letter that has survived, and in that letter she asked for help. She has been, for nearly 5 centuries, one of the most overlooked figures in Tudor history. Her sister Frances has attracted biographers and novelists. Her nieces, Jane, Catherine and Mary Grey, have generated an entire genre of historical interest, with Lady Jane Grey in particular becoming one of the most romanticised and most studied of all Tudor women. Her cousin Margaret Douglas has attracted renewed attention from historians in recent years. Her mother, Mary Tudor, the Queen of France, has a vibrant historical afterlife, celebrated in novels and popular histories for her love story and her fierce spirit. Eleanor gets none of this. She has no famous love story, no dramatic imprisonment, no execution to mark her in the popular imagination. She simply lived and suffered and endured and died. And yet, the more closely one looks at Eleanor Brandon's life, the more one finds a figure of genuine interest and genuine substance. A woman whose story, though quieter than the stories of those around her, is in its own way just as rich, just as full of the difficult and enduring human material that makes the past worth returning to. Consider what she actually lived through. She was born into the heart of the Tudor court, at one of its most brilliant and most dangerous moments. Born to parents whose love story was one of the great romantic scandals of the age, whose union had nearly cost her father his head and had challenged the authority of a king. She grew up surrounded by the magnificent, overwhelming presence of Henry VIII, an uncle who was, by all accounts, genuinely fond of her, who attended her wedding in person, who named her in his will as one of England's potential heirs. She lost her mother when she was 14, lost her only brother the following year, and found herself, at the age of 16, transplanted from the world she had known into an entirely different world, hundreds of miles to the north, in the ancient castles of a family she was only beginning to know. She mourned Catherine of Aragon in the most public and formal way that the Tudor world knew, walking at the head of the funeral procession, receiving the condolences of the assembled nobility, performing on behalf of a family connection that went back to the warmest and closest days of the Tudor court. She did so in place of the woman who should most naturally have been there, Mary, Henry's daughter, who was barred from honouring her own mother. Eleanor stood in for that grief as well as her own, and she did it without fanfare, without complaint, without any surviving record of having found the occasion anything other than a duty to be performed. And then, within the same year, she was at Bolton Abbey when the rebels came. She was 17 years old, or thereabouts, with her infant son and 2 women she was responsible for, and the armed men of the Pilgrimage of Grace forced their way in and took them all hostage. They threatened her with things that no one should threaten anyone with, and in the darkness of an October night, she was led across the Yorkshire moors by a man she trusted because there was no alternative, toward a castle that was itself under siege, carrying her child through the cold and the dark, not knowing what she would find when she arrived. She survived it. She went back to Skipton. She had her children. She buried her sons. She raised her daughter. She wore her purple satin and her crimson damask, and her 11 pairs of velvet shoes in 3 colours, in the rooms and courtyards of a castle that had been rebuilt in her honour by a man who knew exactly what her blood was worth. She wrote to her husband and called him Dear Heart. She died at 27 or 28, in the same castle where her illness had first begun. None of this is nothing. None of it is small. It is a life, compressed and obscured and difficult to recover from this distance, but a genuine, full, complete human life. It is a life lived in full awareness of the weight of Tudor expectation, of the specific kind of privilege and danger that royal blood carried in the 16th century, and of the profound loneliness that came from being sent far from the centre of everything, to do your duty in a cold northern landscape that the court would not come to visit. It is also, in a quiet way, a life that challenges us to think about what we value in historical figures and why. We tend to remember the most dramatic stories, the queens who were executed, the generals who won or lost battles, the rebels who made their stand and paid the price. These stories have the quality of legend, the clarity of crisis, the kind of narrative structure that makes them easy to tell and easy to remember. Eleanor's story has none of that clarity. It has gaps and silences and uncertainties. It has a letter instead of a speech, a chest of shoes instead of a crown, a night crossing of the moors instead of a battle. But those gaps and silences are themselves a kind of story. The story of what is lost when history forgets to look, when the quiet and the remote and the unspectacular are allowed to slip away because other things seemed more important. Eleanor Brandon slipped away. She was alive for 27 or 28 years, and she has been largely forgotten for nearly 500. There is a particular kind of historical injustice that consists not of active suppression, but of simple neglect, of the gradual accumulating indifference of time that allows a person's memory to fade simply because no one thought to keep it bright. Eleanor Brandon suffered this injustice in full measure. She was not destroyed by the Tudor state in the way that her niece Jane Grey was destroyed, or confined and threatened in the way that her niece Catherine Grey was confined and threatened. She was simply allowed to become invisible, first by the circumstances of her life, which kept her in the north and away from the centres of power and documentation, and then by the passage of time, which covered her over with the more vivid stories of the people around her. But invisibility is not the same as insignificance. Eleanor Brandon was significant. She was significant to the people who loved her, to the husband who buried her with her sons in a Yorkshire churchyard, to the daughter who carried her blood forward into a new generation. She was significant to the history of the Tudor succession as the ancestor of the legal heir of England in 1603. And she is significant to us now, tonight, as a reminder of what human lives actually look like when the history books are not watching. Private and frightened and full of feeling, lived in cold castles far from the court, marked by ordinary griefs and ordinary moments of warmth, and sustained, in the end, by the simple fact of having loved someone enough to call them dear heart. In that living and suffering and enduring, she was as fully human as any of the more celebrated figures around her. She was a girl who lost her mother when she was 14. She was a young woman who crossed the moors in the dark to escape a rebel army. She was a mother who buried her sons. She was a wife who called her husband dear heart when she was afraid. She was a granddaughter of the first Tudor king, and through her daughter and her granddaughter and her great-granddaughter, she might, under a different queen's decision at a different moment in history, have given England its rightful queen in 1603. That she did not, that the crown went elsewhere, that her line was set aside, that history moved on without noticing what had been lost, is part of what makes Eleanor's story so quietly, persistently affecting. She was always on the edge of things, on the edge of the succession, on the edge of the court, on the edge of the great events that defined her age. She observed them, was caught up in them, survived some of them, and was ultimately forgotten by most of them. But she was real, she was there, and in her one surviving letter, with its plain words, and its genuine fear, and its unadorned closing signature, she speaks to us still, across 5 centuries of silence, as clearly as if she were in the room. The world that Eleanor Brandon inhabited has, in many ways, vanished. Westhorpe Hall, where she was born, no longer stands. It was demolished in the years following Mary Tudor's death, and today almost nothing remains of the great house where Eleanor spent her childhood. Contemporary drawings made before the hall's demolition show it to have been a substantial courtyard building in the Suffolk style, comfortable, warm in its proportions, and clearly a house that had been genuinely lived in and loved. The orchards and gardens that Mary Tudor had tended, and in which Eleanor had played as a child, are gone. The great chamber where the Brandon family gathered, the rooms where Eleanor's education had been shaped, the windows from which she might have looked out over the flat Suffolk fields, all of it is gone. Only the memory of it remains, preserved in a few old documents and a handful of antiquarian drawings. The court of Henry VIII, with all its magnificence and all its danger, exists now only in the pages of history books and the careful restorations of historians and curators. The palaces where Eleanor visited as a child, Greenwich, Hampton Court, Westminster, have been transformed beyond recognition by centuries of alteration, or reduced to fragments, or lost altogether. The world of Tudor ceremony and colour and danger, which had framed Eleanor's earliest years, has dissolved into archive and imagination. We can reconstruct it, more or less accurately, from the paintings and the documents, but we cannot return to it. The political world of the Tudor succession, that extraordinary human drama of blood and law and ambition and faith, has been resolved long since by the simple fact of time passing and the players leaving the stage. The great succession crisis that had made Eleanor's blood valuable and dangerous, that had overshadowed the lives of her daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter, was settled definitively when the Stuarts took the throne in 1603, and then again, more violently and more permanently, when those same Stuarts were displaced in 1688. The Tudor succession, which had seemed in Eleanor's own lifetime like the most consequential question in the world, is now a matter for historians. But some things remain. Skipton Castle stands. You can visit it today. Walk through the gatehouse. Look up at the round towers that were added in anticipation of Eleanor's arrival. Cross the courtyard, where she must have walked on winter mornings with her breath clouding in the cold Yorkshire air. It is one of the best preserved medieval castles in England, open to visitors throughout the year, and the building that greets you when you enter through its great gatehouse is recognizably the building that Eleanor knew. The towers are still there. The great hall is still there. The chapel still stands. The courtyard still opens out as it did in the 16th century, with the stone flags underfoot and the walls rising around and the Yorkshire sky above. The great gallery that her father-in-law built for her is gone, demolished at some point in the centuries since Eleanor's time. Its timber and plaster returned to the earth long ago. But the towers remain, the towers that were built specifically for Eleanor's arrival, raised stone by stone in the years leading up to her wedding, paid for partly by the sale of Clifford lands. When you stand in the courtyard at Skipton today and look up at those towers, you are looking at something that was built because Eleanor was coming. Her arrival was the reason for their construction. In a very real sense, those towers are her monument. Brougham Castle remains, a roofless but still substantial ruin, beside the river Eamont in Cumbria. The valley in which it stands is even today one of the most beautiful in England. The fells rising away in all directions, the river running clear and quick below the castle walls, the sky wide and changing above. English heritage maintains the site, and visitors can walk through the great keep and look out from its open upper floors over the same landscape that Eleanor looked out over in the last months of her life. The views have not changed. The river Eamon still moves in the same direction. The fells are still the fells. It is a roofless ruin now. The castle was largely left to decay after the death of Lady Anne Clifford in 1676, who had been the last person to truly inhabit it with care and purpose. But it is an evocative ruin, and its evocativeness is in part Eleanor's inheritance. This was the castle where her illness began. This was the place she wrote to her husband about, the place she named in her letter as the origin of the pains that would eventually kill her. This was the last place she lived, and the last landscape she knew. And then there is the letter itself. It is held among the collections that ultimately passed through the Clifford family's papers into the care of scholars and archivists. It is written in the hand of a woman who was afraid, plain and direct and urgent, without the elaborate courtly flourishes that characterized formal Tudor correspondence. It has been transcribed, discussed, and quoted by historians who have found in its few hundred words more of Eleanor's actual humanity than in anything else she left behind. The letter is not a landmark document in the way that a treaty or a legal instrument might be. It does not change the course of history. It is simply one frightened woman's words to the man she loved, and it has outlasted everything else she ever said or did or was. There is something deeply right about the fact that the only piece of Eleanor Brandon's voice that has survived is a letter asking for help. It is not a proclamation or a prayer or a piece of literary ambition. It is not an attempt to be remembered. It is simply communication, the most basic and most human act, between two people who knew and cared for each other, preserved by the accident of the archive through half a millennium of history to reach us now, tonight, as we sit in the quiet of the evening thinking about a woman who has been forgotten for nearly 500 years, and the blood remains. Eleanor's descendants continued long after her death, Margaret Clifford and Margaret's children and their children, and Anne Stanley and Anne Stanley's children, and the generations after them, the thread of Tudor blood growing thinner with each passing decade, but never entirely disappearing. The great dynastic story that began with Henry VII, that passed through Mary Tudor and Eleanor Brandon and Margaret Clifford and the generations beyond, eventually dissipated into the general fabric of English aristocratic life. But it began, in part, with Eleanor. It is part of her legacy, however unrecognized and unacknowledged. And there is this, the way that Eleanor's story, once you encounter it, refuses to leave you entirely. There is something in the combination of privilege and obscurity, of royal blood and provincial life, of great events and personal grief, that makes her figure persistently interesting, persistently worth returning to, worth thinking about, worth telling. She was a person who mattered in her own time, who moved through the great events of the Tudor age with a quiet presence that those events rarely recorded, and who has emerged from the centuries of silence with a clarity and an immediacy that more loudly documented lives sometimes do not possess. She was Henry VIII's niece. She was Mary Tudor's daughter. She was the mother of a woman who might have been queen. She was the writer of a letter that was never meant to outlast her. And she was, in the end, herself, Eleanor, a woman of her time and of her world, doing her best with what she was given, and finding in the cold northern castles of the Clifford family a life that was, for all its sorrows, genuinely her own. That is the story of Eleanor Brandon. That is the story we have been following tonight. And so we come, gently and slowly, to the end of our journey through the life of Eleanor Brandon, Countess of Cumberland. She was born in the warmth of Westhorpe Hall in 1519, into a family that stood at the very heart of the Tudor world. She was raised by two of the most vivid and extraordinary people of her age, a man who had defied the customs of kings to marry the woman he loved, and a woman who had stood in a royal court and demanded to choose her own future. She was given in marriage at 16 to a northern earl, and she crossed from one England to another, from the soft landscapes of Suffolk to the stone and moorland of Yorkshire. She mourned a queen who deserved better mourning. She survived a rebellion that very nearly destroyed her. She buried her sons. She raised her daughter. And in the winter of 1547, she wrote a letter to her husband on Valentine's Day, asking him to send a doctor, because she was frightened and she knew that time was short. She died on the 27th of September, 1547, at Brougham Castle. She was perhaps 28 years old, and she was buried in Skipton Church, alongside the sons she had not been able to keep. 3 members of a family gathered together in Yorkshire earth, in the north of England, far from the golden court that had shaped the earliest years of Eleanor's life, and then let her slip quietly away. The history books have not been kind to her memory, not through any active malice, but through the simple, accumulating indifference of time, which tends to preserve only those stories that contain the most dramatic ingredients: executions, revolutions, the rise and fall of the mighty. Eleanor's story contains none of those things. It contains instead the quieter and perhaps more universal ingredients of an ordinary human life: love and loss, fear and endurance, the effort of making meaning in circumstances not entirely of one's choosing. And yet she was not ordinary. She was the granddaughter of Henry VII. She was the niece of Henry VIII. She was the ancestor of the woman who should, by the terms of her great-great-great-uncle's own will, have been Queen of England in 1603. She was the daughter of one of Tudor England's most remarkable love stories, and she lived her own story, quieter, more provincial, less celebrated, with a dignity and a resilience that the historical record only partially captures, but does not entirely erase. For those qualities alone, she deserves to be remembered. Tonight, we have tried to remember her. We have followed the thread of her life from beginning to end, from the warm, privileged household of her childhood, through the losses and the upheavals of her early years, across the great geographical transition from Suffolk to Yorkshire, through the terror of a rebel siege and the grief of lost children, to the single surviving letter that is the most intimate thing she ever left behind. We have tried to find Eleanor Brandon, not the genealogical fact of her, not the historical footnote, but the woman herself, as much as the centuries of silence and the fragmentary record will allow us to find her. And perhaps tonight we have found a little of her. Perhaps in the quiet of this evening, as the day recedes and the rest you have been looking for begins to find you, Eleanor Brandon is a little less forgotten than she was before. That is enough. That is more than enough. Thank you for spending this evening with Eleanor Brandon, with Sleepy Crown Reborn, and with the quiet, careful work of bringing forgotten lives back into the light. If you have found some peace in her story tonight, if the telling of it has helped you toward the rest you were seeking, then our work here is done. A gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Eleanor's life stayed with you would mean the world to this little family of ours. Sleep well, and we will see